She's gonna have to pee. Oh, shoot. All right, we're going to get started. If Mayor Pro Tem O'Day and Councilmember Morena can, whoever gets in their seats last has to lead us in the pledge. So, yeah.
That's not fair.
Well, we didn't get to sing "Happy Birthday" to you last night at the Boards and Commissions dinner, so we're going to make you suffer now. I think we'll just stick with the pledge. We don't want to drive people out of here and engender workers' comp. Okay, we're going to call the meeting to order, and we're going to have the Pledge of Allegiance led by Mayor Pro Tem O'Day.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Is Sue there? Yes. Okay, I will now call the roll. Councilmember Morena.
Here.
Councilmember Himmelrich.
Here.
Councilmember McKeown.
Here.
Councilmember Winter.
Here.
Councilmember Hara.
Here.
Mayor Pro Tem O'Day.
Present.
And Mayor Davis.
Here. All right, so with all the council members present, are you going to announce the study session?
Oh,
Or, I mean, I guess we don't really have,
so it's a study session, strategic budget direction for the fiscal year 2019 through 2021 proposed biennial budget.
all right. And I think before we hear the staff report, the city attorney's office has a statement.
Yes, thank you, Mayor. I just quickly wanted to state tonight's study session will be a high-level study session on long-term strategy. It's not intended for discussion of specific budget proposals, and to the extent it begins to veer that way, I will cut off any discussion of any peer-related proposals. Those will not be discussed in any way this evening.
All right, and I think before the staff begins, I also should inform people that this is a study session on the long-term strategy for maintaining fiscal balance over the next 6 years, the outline for the fiscal year 19 through 21 budget, and a strategy for reshaping traditional government services to create a government that works better and costs less. Tonight's meeting is not intended to include discussion of specific budget proposals, as the city attorney just mentioned, and will not include, as she also mentioned, any proposals relating to the pier or harbor service officers, city subsidies, to eliminate city subsidies for events such as the LA Marathon and Twilight on the Pier, or a proposal to engage a third party to assume enterprise responsibility for the pier. Discussion of these specific proposals will occur at a future council meeting.
I'm feeling the peer pressure.
And with that, we'll have the staff report.
Good evening, Mayor and members of the City Council, and members of our city staff, and members of the community. I think the budget cuts have already kicked in because we have a broken microphone here. This is the first time in our biennial budget process that we've had a study session before the city manager's recommended budget, which under the charter, I'm required to present you a balanced budget every year. This is an inflection point for Santa Monica's community and government. We intend to stay on the course of the last 30 years, which is to maintain strong fiscal health. That has allowed us to do things that other cities only can dream about. But maintaining it in the face of the threats we'll be talking about will require us to take a long-term approach. And our approach is not simply to live within our means. Our approach is to actually have a stronger government, one that better serves our community, one that fulfills the values of this community, of a commitment to inclusion, a commitment to equity, a commitment to sustainability, a commitment to stewardship. So what we're going to talk about tonight is the framework that you adopted in the last biennial budget, which encompasses the outcomes for a sustainable city of well-being, and our overall strategy for maintaining a fiscal balance over the next decade. We also want to preview the outline of the budget I will be bringing to you on May 25th. And then we want to put that in the context of a longer 6-year strategy to reshape our government to be a truly 21st century government and continue to serve this community even better than it does today. So the presentation, we'll start with a budget strategy and framework. That'll be myself as city manager and our chief performance officer, Tim Dodd. And then we'll ask you at that point for questions on the overall background. Then Gigi Jekavalis-Hughes, our chief financial officer, will present a financial overview of the background for our $750 million combined budgets of general fund and enterprise funds and special funds. And Katie Lichtig, the city's chief operating officer, will talk about the 2019-21 budget outline. Then we'll again pause for questions. And then I will return and talk about the plan for future year budget cycles. And then we'll hear public comment. And then the council will have an opportunity for discussion. Again, as the city attorney pointed out, this is a study session. We're not asking for any action, and no action is necessary. But the value of having this preview is to give you, the staff, and the community a sense of the larger strategy, the larger context in which the budget that I'll be presenting in May fits, and for you to begin to ask the questions so that we can frame our presentations that will be coming to you at the budget workshops in June, so that we can adopt not only the next biennial budget, but adopt a long-term strategy for the city. So let's begin with the budget strategy and framework that Tim and I will be talking about. So again, the goal of all of this effort is the same goal of the 2,300 people who work for this city each and every day, which is in the face of some very dramatic global economic, technological, and demographic changes that we are not an island isolated from, that affect us and affect the people who live here and the people who work here and the people who visit here. How do we create a government that reflects today's world and not only adjusts to the changes happening around us, but frankly addresses some of those changes so that our community is not left behind because of these larger economic and social forces? In specific, the budget is driven by the reality that over the next 10 years, we anticipate a flattening of revenues because we have a 20th century tax system in California, and we have a 21st century economy that we derive revenue from. So anyone who's ordered from Amazon, anyone who, as I do, lives in a Santa Monica building and sees all of the Amazon packages in the foyer, knows that people are spending less money in brick and mortar stores and more money in online sales, and we get a much lower percentage of those sales than we do for stores in our community, stores, restaurants, and other sales tax generators. Sales tax is the #1 source of revenue, not just for this government, but for the $26 million check that we write to the Santa Monica Malibu Unified School District to support quality public education in our community. So we have a 21st century economy and a 20th century 20th century tax system. So revenues are flattening. In some cases, they have actually gone down. In most cases, they are simply going up at a much slower pace than they did, and we expect that trend not only to continue, but probably to accelerate as the world moves away from the 20th century economy on which our tax system is based. Meanwhile, our cost of staffing is going to continue to increase, not because we're giving salary increases beyond the cost of living, but because of the pension overhang that affects all California public agency, both CalPERS members as well as those who have independent pension systems like the City of Los Angeles or the County of Los Angeles. All of them have significant pension challenges, as we do. It is the number one threat to our future. And this budget makes a historic commitment based upon your direction to pay off 100% of our unfunded pension liability in 13 years. Only one other city that we know of in California has adopted a credible plan to do something like that. So we would be the second out of 482 cities in California to make that kind of commitment. We think it's a prudent commitment because it will save the taxpayers of this community more than $100 million over the next 30 years. But even more importantly, it will remove the cloud of the potential of that debt to metastasize if there's another severe economic downturn as we experienced in 2008, 2009. Also in this budget plan is a commitment to the 6 priorities that the Council identified through a widespread community process to really focus on the things that matter most, to make choices to put resources not only of dollars but of staff time to solving some of the most significant challenges facing our community. We'll talk more about that. I also want to emphasize how important this budget plan takes seriously our commitment to our workforce. And that commitment to the workforce is comprehensive. It's not protecting the jobs as they stand today. It's protecting the workers as they have the opportunity to grow and develop in public service. Today, we have the luxury, because of our strong economic position, of providing first-class equipment to our staff, first-class facilities for them to work in, first-class technology for them to utilize, first-class treatment of the opportunity for people to grow and to promote. We don't want to compromise that. We want to commit to our most important asset, which is not cash in the bank, which is not our infrastructure. The most important asset that this city has is the incredibly talented workforce. And we want to continue to invest in their training, their equipment, their facilities, and their future. Finally, we never forget in public service who we serve. We serve the 93,000 people who live here first and foremost. We also serve the businesses that are here, and we serve the people who come here because this is a remarkable place that people have come to for over 100 years and will continue to come to. But first and foremost come the residents. And so we've tried to frame this budget in line with your 6 priorities to better serve the people who live here and to serve them in a 21st century way. We do not want to be the DMV 10 years from now. We want to be the kind of entity that is open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, as most private businesses now operate. Not a place where you have to come down to City Hall when we're open and stand in line. We want to be a place where a digital City Hall allows people to get what they want, what they need, when they want it, and when they need it. Finally, this budget process that we envision gives the opportunity for an orderly and transparent analysis of some ideas for future savings, to make orderly and transparent decisions about those options, and if we move forward with any or all of those options, to do it in an orderly way that is best able to protect the interests of our community and the workforce that serves them. Frankly, this has been the hardest piece of this budget strategy, is we have previewed a number of ideas that are not fully baked. Why have we done that? I recognize the potential to create anxiety among our residents and among our workforce. But if we fail to do that, if we fail, as Benjamin Franklin said, if we fail to plan, we plan to fail. And so we've moved forward in this budget plan some ideas we think deserve greater exploration by you in the public process of this budget process. And should you move those ideas forward through a task force made up of community members and made up of representatives of our workforce, to thoughtfully analyze, thoughtfully decide on recommendations, and to bring those recommendations to you, that will have what are the actual savings, what are the actual proposals, what are the impacts on the community and the workforce, what are the positive benefits that they will bring, and why we recommend that you move forward with them. We think that is the more responsible approach, rather than wait 2 years or 4 years and then try to scramble around and come up with ideas. So these ideas are still in the incipient stage, they are still in the concept stage, but they are ideas that our organization feels, as hard as they may be, are worthy of further exploration and decision making. So, just a reminder, when I deliver on May 25th a book full of line items and numbers encompassing over $700 million worth of expenditures each year of the next 2 years, we can sometimes become mesmerized by those line items. We can sometimes become fixated on the numerics. But really, a budget is not like accounting. Those numbers are not carved in stone. The comprehensive annual financial report, those are real numbers. A budget is a plan. And it's a plan not just for how we're going to spend our money, it's really a plan for how we're going to spend our time, where we're going to put all of our resources, including, again, the most important resource, which is the talented people who work in our community. I've said this on occasion, I think it bears repeating. I work about 60 hours a week. That's what being a city manager in a demanding community like this entails. But our organization works 88,000 hours a week. That's an extraordinary amount of time, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Our firefighters, our police officers, our librarians, our accountants, our code enforcement officers, our recreation workers, on and on. They put in 88,000 hours a week of service to this community. That's where the rubber meets the road. And the budget is about allocating that time and making sure that it goes to the highest priorities and is in the most effective and efficient manner that we can serve this community. And ultimately, a budget is not just a statement of finances and not just a statement of your work plan. It's ultimately an expression of this community and this council's values and priorities. We've paid special attention in this process to the council priorities. That's why we asked you to sit with us during the retreat and identify, out of all of the many things that we do in this community, and part of this budget process is illuminated that we do 668 things, plus or minus. What are the most important things that we do? And let's focus on those. We'll talk a little bit about that as we move forward. Finally, this budget plan is meant to be flexible. Because it's a long-term approach, it will evolve over the next 6 years. But it's okay to have a plan evolve as long as you have a plan. And this represents a comprehensive approach, not just to our next 2 years, not just to our next 6 years, but for laying the foundation for the next decade of success for our community. Again, this represents the priorities. I want to just touch again on the 6 that you chose. Affordability, again, even in the weeks since your retreat, we've seen evidence of more and more symptoms of how existential this threat is to the identity of Santa Monica as an inclusive community. With housing prices literally going through the roof, it has an impact on every aspect of the community. And there's nothing more critical than being able to protect our residents as much as possible from displacement and from losing the things that make Santa Monica a balanced community. Climate change needs no reinforcement. I think every day we see more evidence of the impact on us as a coastal community of unchecked climate change. And we will be bringing to you next month an extraordinarily ambitious plan, not unlike what has just been presented in the city of Los Angeles, which surrounds us on 3 sides, to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050. An engaged and thriving community encompasses a wide range of issues around involving our community in well-being. Not just a government responsibility, but an entire comprehensive approach of our school system, our community organizations, our civic groups, our nonprofit groups, and residents in their neighborhoods. Keeping neighborhoods safe, we, over the last 3 years, have seen an increase in Part 1 crimes in our city of 26%. Fortunately, the actions taken by Interim Chief Semko and Chief Renault are already paying off. The crime began to go down last fall and is now on a consistent pattern of going down for the first time in memory because of aggressive cooperation between the police department and our human resources operation. Without lowering standards, we've been able to finally fill every single police officer position in our city, and that is also beginning to pay off on the issues of security and keeping our neighborhoods safe. Mobility and access, I won't say more about that. We are the center in the Los Angeles region of a commitment to Vision Zero, of a commitment to alternative mobility, and in fact, just saw some figures today that show that out of all of Southern California, we have the highest mode split of alternatives to people driving alone in their cars. And finally, as we'll talk a significant amount in the rest of this report, we have a real commitment to continuing the Council's focus on a regional effort to reduce homelessness. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tim Dodd to talk about the framework and how we've built the budget on the framework that you adopted 2 years ago. And then when Tim's finished, then Tim and I will take questions on the kind of background of this strategy. And then after the questions, then we'll go to the next part of the presentation. So Tim?
Thank you, Rick. So the framework for a sustainable city of well-being really is the strategic visioning document for the city of Santa Monica. As Rick mentioned, it was created 2 years ago, and it was based on 3 pillars: on the Sustainable City Plan, the Well-Being Index, and then principles of 21st century government. So I know it's a little bit light, but the wheel right here basically represents everything we do as a city. So in the budget that you'll see on May 25th, you'll see under the department sections, approximately 650 activities, which represent everything we do. All of those activities will be mapped to what we call outcomes and sub-outcomes. The outcomes, there are 7 of them. They're the large areas in the middle, so governance, and then the other 6 that are around it. And they're also mapped to sub-outcomes, which are basically the dedicated work streams that come off from the different outcome areas. So what we're trying to do is create a system that allows us, through department and divisional tracking, what are we doing? As part of the budget, are we doing it well? And as part of are people better off because of what we're doing and how well we're doing it? And that's ultimately the system that we want to build. Obviously, developing that does take time. There's a lot of trial and error in this work. One of the things that's really important to stress as well is that the areas that are colored a little bit darker or shaded darker, those are the 6 priorities. So the 6 priorities also double as work streams, as sub-outcomes, but these are the areas that we're focusing on as part of the process that Rick mentioned. So I just wanted to share with you a few updates. So the framework, as we mentioned, was created 2 years ago. There is an updated draft version for your review that is part of an attachment to the staff report. It will, again, as Rick said, be a part of the budget presented on May 25th for your consideration at your meetings in early June. But there are a few changes that we did make to the framework based on, a lot of it was based on the direction that came out of the January 6th retreat. So the first one is that we integrated the values into the framework. So previously there were 4 sub-outcomes, 4 work streams under governance. What we did is we basically looked at the work that was mapped there, and we looked at the values. We developed definitions for the values that are part of the draft framework, and we basically looked at mapping the work under governance to these values. And so eliminating the sub-outcomes, because there was a lot of redundancy. For example, there was a lot of redundancy between things like transparency and accountability and stewardship and effective and efficient business processes. A second thing we did is that we added, developed, and highlighted framework priorities. So each of the 6 priorities had a dedicated team of subject matter experts from our staff that worked incredibly hard, sometimes meeting 2 or 3 times a week. They each had chair people that poured several hours into this process, and they developed plans of action that I'll talk about in a few moments. But we also developed those areas based on the identification of those priorities. And then finally, based on a vote that you took on January 26th, we added mobility and access as a sub-outcome and also worked with that team to develop outcome metrics and a definition for that area. So the framework priorities, as we talked about, each of those there are draft plans. So there are 6 priorities. There are 5 plans that are attached. Engaged and thriving community is the newest of the priorities. All of the other priorities were either sub-outcomes or related to a strategic goal that previously existed under the old construct. Engaged and thriving, that team is working just as hard as the other teams. We do plan to come back to you in June with a draft plan of action for that group. We just wanted to give them the time that they need to basically develop a concrete definition for the term, understand how it fits into their community outcome area, understanding the line between engaged and thriving and learning. Previously, thriving was part of learning and thrive, which learning is its own outcome area, and also really to understand the work that's currently mapped to engagement, which was engaged community was the previous sub-outcome. So we want to make sure the work there is mapped correctly and that we've defined solid measures of success. And so that's why you don't have it in front of you, and that's why you have the other 5. So the structure of the plan of action essentially is defining the work, what is it that we're doing, and also what does success look like. So having high level, ideally in most cases we're looking, and again this does take time, but we're looking for the metrics that will help us understand, are people better off? We've also aligned existing investments. So primarily that means we've worked with the CIP team, the Capital Improvement Program team, to identify CIP dollars that we're spending in these areas. In some areas, like in homelessness, there's some new one-time investments that are recommended that are part of the plan. We also looked at, as I mentioned, all the work that we do as a city is mapped into about 650 activities. We took the activities and their draft output metrics, which really measure how well we're doing things, and we map those as part of the plan. And those will be the things that we monitor on a regular basis as part of our SAMOSTAT process. And just to talk a little bit, the framework engagement is really important. We created a performance advisory group of staff that involves department heads, division managers, and performance liaisons to basically help us look at definitions, help us make sure that things match and are aligned correctly. We've had several meetings internally with subject matter experts to review their pieces of the document. We did several different pieces of staff engagement through surveys, through leadership team meetings, and then finally have reached out to all boards and commissions and certain nonprofits to see if they are interested in receiving a presentation. And we have about 14 that are scheduled. I think there's about 6 that I've done already, and then the additional 8 are scheduled going into May. So as Rick mentioned, now it's time for he and I to answer any questions that you may have.
All right, do we have any questions from council members at this point? I guess I'm not seeing, Councilmember Winterer.
Even though we're not on the radio, I don't want to have dead downtime. My first question is just every time I look at that framework on that top, I think, am I the only one who thinks about Trivial Pursuit and those 3 little pie places?
Well, you're not the only one.
I think it's a generational thing, council member.
So we received some correspondence from the Conservancy about concerns about that we don't have historic preservation worked into the framework sufficiently. I do notice that in the sub-outcome area of built environment, it says a city that maintains and enhances spaces, including historic spaces and landmarks. So well, you mentioned this is an evolving document, all this process. Are there opportunities down the road to sort of emphasize historic preservation more? I mean, I guess my concern is, we're trying to do a lot within, limited resources, but you can defer infrastructure maintenance. You can do things like that, but if you don't make sure you put enough emphasis on historic preservation, we've all seen what happens in places like, Penn Station in New York City. Once you lose something, you're never going to get it back. So are there opportunities down the road, since given that we are really agendized to take any actions tonight to try to highlight some of that?
Not very far down the road, Councilmember. We've heard the council's commitment not only to the idea of historic preservation, but to the realities of implementing our policies so that they have reality on the ground. So one of the changes inside planning and community development that will be in my budget on May 25th creates for the first time, or at least for the first time in a long time, a position dedicated to doing the work that the council has laid out on historic preservation. We've been able to do that in a cost-neutral way by eliminating a vacant position and substituting a planner who will be devoted to that work. We think that there's more than enough work to keep someone who has expertise in that arena busy.
Great, excellent, thank you.
Councilmember Moreno.
All right. So first, thank you for putting all this together. This is not easy work.
Well, let me thank the team, and particularly our very hardworking budget team, which is not just in the finance department, but in each department there's a budgeteer, plus of course the department heads, and so many others have been involved in this effort.
So thank everybody in the room who's worked on this. This is not easy stuff, and in so much as getting down into how to evaluate things and including the public and public dollars, the complexity just grows infinitely. So I appreciate it. I understand it. I love it too. This is the stuff that I've been working on for about 20 years. And so I learned a long time ago that finance is the way money moves, was the best explanation I've heard, whereas accounting tracks what has been done. So this is really an exercise and something that I really enjoy doing. So I'm interested in the mechanics of it. And I think that's where we're at in the process. So as you've outlined, we'll have task forces, right? And we'll have task forces that apply to each individual area. Is that correct?
I'm anticipating a single task force that would be made up of community members who would bring real skills to this. So not so much a politically representative body. As a group of community residents, we have an incredibly talented community. And there are some people who, as they always do on our commissions and our boards, step forward for public service, as well as the folks who represent our workforce to make sure. So we're not far along in that, and we're open to council input on the makeup of the task force, but we're anticipating that it would convene this fall and bring recommendations through me to you for the next, the second year of the biennial budget, and then would reconvene after the adoption of that budget for the second round of analysis.
Okay. So the task forces that will be created are really not for this budget. They're really for the next budget.
For
right?
the second year of the biennial budget.
Right.
So
Okay.
it's really for this budget because it's a 2-year budget, but not for the year that begins on July 1st.
Right. Okay.
And again, whether it's one task force or more than one task force, I think remains to be seen. I think from the standpoint of being able to have a transparent process that our staff can support, I think one task force will keep us busy.
Yeah. Okay. That makes sense to me. So you said community members, part of our staff will be on that team?
Yeah, my anticipation, we in the Pension Advisory Committee, we had folks representing organized labor. I would think we would also have representatives of management on that, but primarily staff would also, of course, staff this. My thought is that of the ideas that are on both lists, the list for the second year of the biennial, as well as the list for consideration in the second and third biennials, that the first analysis, the first level of work would be done probably by that department, if it's a single department, in consultation with the budget folks in finance, and bring forward a proposal with pros and cons and alternatives and some research about what other cities are doing and some research about new technology that might come into bear. So then the task force would hear that, consider that, ask tough questions, and then through this process come to a recommendation about either approving that recommendation, modifying that recommendation, or rejecting the recommendation. That would be a recommendation to me as city manager, so that when I present the budget, I would obviously give great weight to those recommendations. And then I would hope that you would give equal weight to our recommendations to you, but ultimately you're the final deciders.
So one of the things that when I was graduating school, business school, I learned that big finance shops were hiring people out of art school. And they were doing that because we had gotten lazy in general in our practice. And what ended up happening is one of my buddies got a big job, and he became the boss of a really big department, which ultimately became the point of interface between consumers and Deutsche Bank. Right? It's a big company. And his perspective was one of an artist. And so he made all of the interface something that people could understand, because most folks weren't interested in the technical aspects of it. So it seems to make sense that we would have some cross-pollination between departments and having different perspectives, so much so that artists could weigh into finance and vice versa. And I'm sure there's a bunch of other mix-ups that would prove beneficial in that process. More on the technical side, once we get these kind of measurements, values, metrics, et cetera, how does that then flow into our new ERP system? And how does that provide true tracking on the back end of that recommendation?
It's a good question, Council Member, and I think that if you want an in-depth answer, our Chief Financial Officer is probably the best equipped to do that. But in a general sense, this mapping effort to not just look at the line items, we're spending this much money on personnel, we're spending this much money on materials, this much money on contracts, but rather what is it being tracked to, right? So one of the things we do is we do a farmer's market, right? And so what's our profit? What's our loss? How do we measure the benefit to the community? Is it number of people? Is it sales? Is it access for people who don't have regular access to affordable, fresh, organic produce? You know, what are the measures? And then when we have the measures, where the ERP comes in is we can then track the expenses and match them to the outcomes. And the whole idea of 21st century government is stuff that works, you do more of. Stuff that doesn't work, you do less of. Let me give you a quick additional example. We have two models that we've deployed out in our streets around homelessness. One is the hamster team, the homeless multidisciplinary street team, and the second is the C3 team. One is jointly funded between us and the county. One is we're bearing the cost of. Both of them are subcontracted. Those are not our staff, but we are giving very close supervision. One, on the basis of the number of people it touches, is much more expensive per person than, and that's the street team, versus the C3 team. The C3 team are seeing a lot more people, and so their cost per person is much lower. But the RAND study that we're doing is showing that the impact on our other expenses of emergency rooms, jail visits, transports by our fire department to emergency rooms is being dramatically impacted by the hamster team. So where your question goes to is we begin to connect results with expenses, and we begin to see return on investment. We begin to see where are we getting the most bang for the dollar. We've always had anecdotal sense about that, and we have some departments that are pretty far advanced in this. Big Blue Bus, we were able to bring to you some recommendations that only modestly trimmed bus service, reinvested part of the savings in improved bus services in a way that really has not had a big impact on services, and the impact has largely been positive. So where you match dollars spent with results achieved, that's where you get the biggest bang for the buck, and we're getting better at that.
Yeah, I can see it, and I know it, and I've had this conversation at length.
Did you want to
with
add
Gigi.
anything to that, Gigi?
No, and I get it. I mean, we're staying high level here until we get further into the meeting. But the other, and you anticipated my question, which was ROI, return on equity, which is something that we don't often discuss. I've actually never heard it discussed in government, but it's a really good indicator of how to put our arms around the value centers in the city. And I know that the ERP will give us that ability to do so. So I want to flag that in a way to map our different business centers in the way that we earn revenue. And then something that is really esoteric that hasn't been discussed, but how to measure well-being. And then ultimately what that means, whether it's a return on well-being or a well-being value. I know we have an index, and I've read the RAND study, but we have to have our own determination of what is value added.
The framework is in an effort to take advantage of the work we've been doing for 20 years on sustainability and measuring impact on water self-sufficiency, on clean air, on energy efficiency, et cetera, and the work of the well-being index over the last 5 years, and actually graft them into the DNA of how we work.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you very much, and thank you, everybody, for all of your work.
Councilmember McEwen?
So a budget is an essay written in the language of dollars. But the essay is not about dollars. As you pointed out, the subject of the essay, the budget, is really our values. So unfortunately, we have to deal in dollars, but we have to get to values. How do we do a true cost evaluation of the things that we cut and the things that we add? And keeping in mind that it's a holistic system. It's, if we were to cut some money in youth services, we might be then creating the need for an expenditure in police services. There are many areas where things would have cross-departmental impacts. How are we going to be evaluating those as we come up with this budget?
Well, I'd be overselling our capacity to say that we've got a perfect system. I can say that I think we're further advanced than the vast majority of public sector institutions at getting our arms around those choices. And I think it's important to think that if we're able to slow the growth of staffing, slow the growth of incremental expenditures, just as our 13-year pay down of the pension saves us money in the long run. That I really don't think this is much about cutting safety or cutting education or cutting libraries. It's really taking the dollars we have and using them more efficiently. So if we can do that, if we can squeeze out those efficiencies, we begin to change the trajectory. Right now we have this delta that gets, in the out years, 10 years out, the delta between our flattening revenues and our rising costs is between $30 and $45 million. That's really a staggering amount in a budget of our size. But if we can begin that gentle slope down of our expenses so that and if we can increase our revenues, then we eliminate that delta. That's our goal over the long run. So I don't mean to say that there will not be some reductions in services over the long run, but our focus is not on reducing services. Our focus is on improving outcomes.
And my question had more to do with how do we avoid the easy trap of dealing in dollars when we should be dealing in values. I'll give you an example. For many years, people have argued that programs in the arts are justifiable because there's an economic payback, that money you invest in the arts in a community comes back 3 times or 5 times in various other economic ways. But that's not the only way to look at why it's important to have an arts program in a city. So as we deal with dollars, when and how will we say, well, the dollars are important, but the values are what's driving us, and therefore we're making this decision instead of that decision?
Yeah, I think that's ultimately why the 7 of you were elected by the community. Again, under our separation of powers under the charter, it's the responsibility of the city manager to propose a budget, and it's the responsibility of the city council to adopt a budget. And I think, I hope myself and any successors who stand before you over the next 10 years, and all of the folks who support you, will continue to bring you the very best information for you to make judgments about those. And there's going to be some balances between an economic analysis. But right now, I think we need to improve and sharpen our pencils about giving you economic analysis and metrics about success. That's our challenge, and we think we're up to it.
So to extend that hierarchy that you were talking about, that, you know, it's the council that makes the decision, you propose the budget, but we ultimately are accountable for the residents of the city. And I think it's unrealistic that the 7 of us, you know, be able to do the kind of research and talk to everybody in the city to know what's important to them. Staff helps us a great deal with that. What are the plans to find out as we run these proposals through and as the council discusses them and as people hear about them out there in the public, how are we going to find out what's really important to residents? Because as you and I have discussed, of all the things that councils do, probably the budget's one of the most important, and it's one of the ones that's least talked about by the residents of the city. They're much more concerned about the new 3-story building going up down the block than the $700 million budget for the city. So how can we, as a council, do our job, which is to listen to the people we should be listening to, so that you and the staff can, in turn, listen to us when we decide what the values are that we want to pursue in the budget?
Councilmember, I think you've pinpointed a challenge of democracy in our time. When I talk to my colleagues in the other 481 cities in California, they're facing similar challenges. The decline of traditional media, which provided some level of basic information about what was happening at the city hall in any given community. And we saw in places like Bell where the disappearance of that kind of traditional media resulted in really catastrophic failures of democracy. And so we're seeing traditional media struggle to stay alive and to continue to put resources into journalism. That government can't do that. That's why we have a First Amendment and a Fourth Estate. And so they're struggling. You have an aging population in which some of the most dedicated people to this community are in their 50s, their 60s, their 70s. They always vote. They care about this community. They pay attention to traditional media. And yet you have the future of Santa Monica, which is our younger generation, our young families and singles who've not yet started families. And how do we reach them? Because it's certainly not going to be through traditional media. And how do we reach them in a constructive way where we're not spinning the story, where we're giving them the same kind of both sides of the story that they would get from the press when the press had greater reach into the community. So that's a real challenge, and we look to the richness of this community to help us challenge that. What I do worry about is hearing only from the people who have a stake in a particular issue or a particular program. One of my colleagues, the city manager of Irvine, was the city attorney in Oakland, and he said Oakland was in such stressed financial condition that we could only afford to fund core services, right? No frills, no unnecessary expenses, only the core services. And he said, how do we define core services? Core services were, if we cut them, it would fill the council chamber, right? So it's a politically driven process, right? If you scream, yell loud enough, your program will be saved. And that meant that our underground utilities, or their underground utilities, didn't get it because no one would scream to say, you got to fix your pipes. No one would say fix the recreation center roof until it collapsed. So this is a real challenge, and we welcome your thoughts. We've already, through the process of identifying priorities, we've done a survey. We'll be out on the road. Gigi will be at NOMA, I think next week, this Thursday, to talk to folks. We will do everything we can to get the message out. But how we develop a balanced two-way dialogue that's not just don't cut the thing that I can see down my block, but how do we get people to be involved in making these harder choices? I think that's a tough challenge.
You and I have both been at this a while, and I think we both could predict that if we base the budget merely on agitated public outcry, our budget would be about scooters and little else. So the problem is that input without outreach gives you a distorted view of what the public wants. I'm asking about the outreach. I mean, 20 years ago, we had a finance director who used to go to the farmer's market with charts and harangue passersby about budget, whether they cared about it or not. And that got a certain kind of input from people who were not normally engaged with budget processes that was useful. Sometimes that input is not informed enough to be useful. That's the challenge. I'm just trying, since we're doing something really new here. This is a new way of crafting a budget that we as a city have never tried before. I'm not sure how many cities have done this before. I just want to make sure that we engage the public to every extent possible, because otherwise we're guessing, and that's a dangerous game.
Well, without overpromising, we will definitely work hard on outreach between now and June 25th. But we have a lot of other outreach efforts going on at the same time, and there's limited bandwidth.
Councilmember Himmelrich.
I'm a little troubled by the last conversation because after going out to a farmer's market and actually saying to people, will you come and put dots on this chart? And they would sort of blow me off. And then I would say, do you care how we spend our money? Do you live in Santa Monica? And boom, they would be there. So I do believe that people care about more than their one issue. Mm-hmm. It's been my experience that, yes, there are the me people out there who, are you saving, the hedges on my block? Are you doing, and I'm not saying that those are non-values, but what I am saying is that if you say to most people, do you care how we spend our money? They do care, and they don't only care about themselves. So I think that if we do outreach in a way where we're really saying to people, do you care how we spend our money? They will respond, and they will respond in a way that is not only about themselves.
Well
But-
said.
But let me just say that Councilmember McEwen thinks the budget is about values. I think it's about people. I always think it's about people. And I do have a couple questions. So in terms of what you're bringing forward at a higher level tonight, is it based on well-being and sustainability?
Well, again, the framework is built on the work that has been done in this city over the last 20 years in the sustainability field and the last 5 years in well-being. But the framework is about more than, well-being is really a broader umbrella. And then we have the dimensions of well-being and sustainability that make up this comprehensive approach. So it's really about all the things that make up a healthy community. Our Latin motto is a happy people in a happy place, or a fortunate people in a fortunate place. I think ultimately that's the best distillation of both sustainability and well-being.
Right, but I want to talk about metrics, outcomes, and where we have gaps in what we're doing now. And where we have redundancies in what we're doing now. And I also, one of the things that concerned me about the report we received is that there's so much emphasis on costs and little emphasis on revenues. At least in my opinion. Now, you can tell me that that's wrong.
We are going to talk about revenues, and I agree with you that for two reasons, it's actually, yes, for two reasons, I think that's the way we pitched it. And this is, again, part of why we're bringing you a preview. We're looking for your thoughts. But first, the perception, and to some degree the reality, of this community is that this community bears a high level of taxation. And the revenue sources that are available to local governments are inherently regressive, right? So while we have great wealth in this community, the tax system doesn't necessarily reflect everyone paying their fair share. Now, of course, wealthy people say, well, I pay way more, but of course only 14 cents of the property tax dollar actually comes to the local government. 86% of it goes to other public sector entities. So one reason is when we raise taxes, we have to think about what is the impact on affordability, right? Which is one of our core goals. We don't want to make this an increasingly unaffordable place because of the burden of public services. The second reason that we haven't talked about that is we can't guarantee that, right? We can strive to make this a more amenable business climate without damaging quality of life, which is always a tough balance in Santa Monica. And we can put measures on the ballot, which is required by California law, because if we even change a tax, let alone create a new one, it requires going to the voters and getting majority or sometimes 2/3 approval. So we didn't want to count on revenue that isn't out there, and we didn't want to count on revenue that might be squeezing the folks who are kind of hanging on by their fingernails. And that's not just low-income people in our community. A lot of middle-class people feel like they're hanging on by their fingernails because of the cost of living here.
You I think, are thinking in a traditional government way, which is the only way
That's
for a
the worst
city.
thing you've ever said to me, Sue.
I'm sorry. I'm sure it isn't, by the way. Oh, that's nice. But I'm not sure that the only way to generate revenues for a city is taxes.
Okay, and I don't want to interrupt, but this is questions. We have two more parts of the presentation.
Fair enough.
So I'm afraid we're kind of venturing into comments as opposed to questions.
I was going to ask a question, Gleam, and for some reason it's always me where you stop it. So I just have to say, may I finish?
Yeah, sure, I'm sorry,
Thank you.
we have 2 more presentations.
So I want to talk to you, or I want to ask you, let me put it this way, about thinking about revenues in context other than taxes, and have we done that?
Well, there are a number of items in our long range which include that, such things as sponsorships, naming rights. There's a tremendous value to the brand. We do not want to sell our soul for commercial interest, but there are some things that we can do that are pretty simple, like putting on a trash can at the beach, brought to you by so-and-so, that I don't think causes heart attacks, and if it generates some revenue and lets us put a few more trash cans on the beach and get them picked up more often, I think we can overcome some of those things. That's just one relatively low level opportunity. But yeah, I think there are a lot of opportunities to grow the revenue. But remember, our revenues are flattening, so we're going to have to sort of run twice as fast just to keep up.
Well, and that's my question. If we looked at different sources of revenues than the ones we traditionally, other than
We are
naming
committed
rights.
to do that, and you'll see that later in the presentation.
And will that be the task force, or would that be?
I don't think that would be the focus of the task force. I think that's probably a separate effort, and we can talk about how to structure that.
Thank you.
Councilmember Morena?
Just one more little question. Following Kevin's lead a little bit in the task force, and how do we include people? I know we've steered away from the Facebook and the digital realm just because it's so amorphous. Have you thought about how we're going to really get people from all parts of the city to contribute? And the idea of one task force or many, have you considered the impacts of what multiple task forces would look like and how that would blend into the structure?
Again, I think we can do more thinking on that. I think it's unrealistic to go from 0 to 60, right? The last 4 or 5 budget processes, there were, 70 people here for a public hearing, and then we get to Gigi's presentation on the budget at 10 o'clock, and you could shoot a cannon and not hit anybody. We've gone from a time when people kind of took our budgets for granted. They might gripe about them on Facebook, but there was essentially zero participation. So I think we can get greater participation in this budget process, but I think it'll take a couple of budget processes for us to really get the kind of widespread full buy-in. Remember, we're spending a couple hours, and most people don't have that kind of bandwidth to. We do have some people, and we need to find them. And I'm committed to doing broad outreach to make sure we don't just have the usual suspects. On the other hand, I think we do need some folks who have some continuity and who understand, the values of this community over the last 30 years. So, we tried to do that with the Pension Advisory Committee, and I think we did a good job.
Yeah, great, thanks.
All right, I think we're ready for the next part of the presentation.
Good evening, everyone. So, oops, I'm going the wrong way. All right, so I was going the right way. All right, so I'm going to be talking a little bit about just providing an overview of the budget. And I'm going to take it to a very high level that I don't usually go to, just to provide some perspective based on the fact that we are doing an overview today. So our citywide budget in fiscal year 18-19, so this fiscal year, we don't have, we're not giving you the numbers yet for next year's budget because we don't have our budget published yet. But right now we're at $734 million. That is including operating budgets, the ongoing day-to-day budgets, as well as our capital improvement program budget. CIP, our capital improvement program, is about 25% of the $734 million. Our budget is further broken out into general fund and enterprise or other funds. And about 2/3 of our budget is going towards the general fund, and 40%, the rest of it is going towards enterprise funds. The difference, what a general fund is, and this is for everyone who's in here as well, the general fund is pretty much for the public good. These are expenses that are going towards the public good. It's mostly tax funded, and we do have some things that are, some revenues that are coming in that are, we're getting money for things that are coming in for individual services. Enterprise funds are more like small businesses, and we like to, like BBB, like wastewater, like water. It's for items that if an individual is spending a certain number of units of something, they actually pay for that. The difference there is that enterprise funds are able to receive their revenue from rates, and rates, we are required by law to go out every few years and do a rate study so that we can make sure that we are recovering our costs for those funds. So that's just a little bit. The other difference is ongoing funds, operating or operating budgets are ongoing. Capital program money can be one time. So I mentioned this is a chart of the general fund revenues, the revenue streams, and I mentioned that general fund is majority tax funded. The pieces of the pie that are blue are taxes, and the other colors are the areas where we're able to charge individuals for the individual services that they receive. So as Rick has mentioned, the general fund revenue streams are flattening. Something that is happening across the board in all cities. And where we're seeing some of most of our flattening is in sales taxes, and flattening growth is what I mean, is sales taxes and in parking. And those are the 2 or 3 pieces of the pie that I've pulled out a little bit. Sales tax represents about 18% of the total of our revenue streams, and parking, which is part of licenses and permits, represents about 10% of our total revenue stream. And if you see that tiny little sliver on the bottom, that's our parking facilities tax, and that is if people are parking less, that means that our private parking operators are generating less in parking tax. To give you an idea of how much our revenues are flattening, in the years after the recovery, we were seeing 8% annual growth. In the past 3 years, we were seeing about 4% annual growth, and we are expecting our annual growth over the next 10 years of our forecast to be between 2 and 2.2%. And one of the things that I did want to mention, since we have this chart up, something that our rating agencies always really like to see is how many pieces our pie has, and how nicely separated or kind of equal they are. We have a very diversified revenue base, and that has really helped us be resilient even during times of downturn, and obviously we're hoping to keep it that way. So as you can see, that's a challenge, but the other challenge that, as we've been talking about, is in our significantly increasing expenditures. So there are 3, the city is very much a service-oriented city, so we have a lot of employees who are providing services. So our personnel costs, our compensation-based costs, at least overall in the city, are about 60% of the budget. In the general fund, where we don't have as much equipment and big items in our supplies and expenses, there in the general fund, it's about 70% of our operating budget. And the 3 big cost drivers in labor are our workers' compensation costs, which are pretty much dictated by state laws. Healthcare, which is an issue that we're having across the board in this country. One of the things that, as we've reported to you recently, we now have a 3-year contract with our insurance provider that's brought our costs down for the next 3 years at least, but it's something that we're continuing to work on. And of course, there is our pension, unfunded pension liability costs. So the chart that's in front of you I wanted to point your attention mostly to the green line at the top. And this chart shows how much we're paying right now in for our pension costs, which is about $52 million a year. That is net of employee cost sharing. And what's going to happen over 10 years is that our pension costs are going to go up. Pretty much they're going to double to about $103 million by the end of the 10-year forecast. And the reason for this is the growth, as you can see in the red line, which is the unfunded liability. That red line and that unfunded liability is what we owe today. It doesn't include future years' unfunded liability. The other thing that, by way of explaining what I've explained to you in information items and the staff report, the reason for these increases in the unfunded liability is that aside from the big hit that PERS took during the recession, since that time they have been working very hard to stabilize the fund, and so they're going into lower risk investments. They have figured out better ways to amortize the liability over the years. Before, everything was a little too soft, and it wasn't the most responsible way to actually receive money from cities. The point in the old times was to keep the costs lower and very stable instead of actually making sure that the fund was funded. So as they're kind of getting their act together, it means that we are going to have to be making bigger contributions. So with this in mind, we brought in an independent actuary, someone who's not from PERS, and Rick pulled together a pension advisory committee, and since about the end of last summer, we've been working with the actuary and then with the pension advisory committee to think of different ways that we could mitigate our pension liability. And after a lot of analysis that's included, it's summarized in the information item that's included in the staff report, we came up with paying down our pension liability, the liability that we owe today, over 13 years instead of the 30-year rate, or the 30-year term. And the lines in this chart are showing you, the blue line is what we would usually be paying in pension liability, and you can see that it is taken out over 30 years and that we have quite a bit towards the end. If we pay it off over 13 years, you can see that's the orange line, so it is an increment over what we have to pay, and about 2/3 of the way through, you see that there's a drop in the in the current way that we're supposed to be spending it. But if we just kept going in that trajectory, we'd go for about 4 or 5 more years, and then we wouldn't have to pay this current unfunded liability anymore. We'd still be paying the normal costs, what we earn every year, or what we accrue every year, and potentially other unfunded liability amounts that come up later, but it wouldn't be at that level. And we would save $106 million in interest costs over the next 30 years if we did this. So it is a little bit of some pain in the short run, but there is a lot of gain in the future years. So considering everything that I've just told you, this chart is showing you our 5-year forecast, or our 10-year forecast. It looks somewhat like what we showed you back in January, but has some updated numbers. We have 4, you can see 5 lines there, but 4 lines, aside from the green line, are from the top, the best case scenario, if we have better revenues than we anticipate. Our baseline scenario in the blue line, a moderate recession, kind of like a dot-com recession with the yellow line, and then the dotted line at the bottom is a Great Recession type of recession that we hope we don't see. And you can see that those are all coming in the first couple years there. So the difference between what we showed you last time and what we have here is that we've actually added the 13-year pay down amounts to the general fund expenditures, and what you're seeing here is revenues over expenditures. And you can see that in the first year of our biennial, in fiscal year 1920, we are seeing a $2.5 million shortfall, rising to $6.1 million in the second year. And as Rick mentioned before, we're seeing $34 or $47 million shortfalls in our after 10 years. But based on what we're going to be talking about next, we're going to be telling you about some efficiencies that we're looking at short term, as well as our 6-year plan to come up with some midterm and long-term efficiencies. And so what we've done is we've added the reductions and changes that we are considering over the next 6 years to this forecast, and that's the green line. And now you can see that we are no longer showing a shortfall basically during the first two biennial, or the first and second biennials out of our 6-year period. Once, it also tells you that we're going to have to keep making some changes, but we don't really have a choice but to make these to look in this direction. And what it does is it actually cuts our shortfall by half or more than half after 10 years. So they do make a big difference. There's a lot of compounding as we make our budget smaller in the early years. It's not growing at the same rate. So that's my part of the presentation, and so I can take any questions.
Councilmember Himmelrich?
Thanks for that, Gigi. And I do have a question, and I guess I think about this every time I look at the chart where it drops after 13 years. And my question is this: what if CalPERS, all these other cities except for Newport Beach and possibly us, have made no plans, basically? I mean, I think they're sort of wallowing around in it, but what happens if CalPERS basically can't meet, or the cities within CalPERS can't get out of CalPERS what they need for their pensions?
Well, our money is strictly our money. It's not, if that's one of the things. So what we are putting into CalPERS, it's our pool. It's always the city's assets.
And it always has been.
And it always has
but
been.
What I'm thinking about, what I worry about is that there's some terrible emergency where they change the nature of CalPERS to rob Peter to pay Paul. I mean, I know that hasn't happened, but is it possible it could happen?
I don't think it's possible that it could happen. You know, there are laws behind CalPERS. There are agreements. I think a lot of things would happen before the state would take money from CalPERS. I don't know that it can even happen.
So is it 90? Well, I'm not worried about what the state's going to do. What I'm more worried is if all these cities are facing bankruptcy, right,
Yes.
because they can't pay their unfunded liability, what CalPERS is going to do with their unfunded liability, because each year they owe stuff.
Yeah, they would, yeah, as Katie said, they would reduce benefits, but at this point, they would reduce benefits to those cities.
That's what I'm asking.
Yes.
So we would not face a reduction
No.
in benefits. It would only be those cities with a shortfall because our fund is clearly defined.
That's right.
Thank you.
Councilmember, Mayor Pro Tem O'Day.
I was sure you would go longer, so I wasn't ready. Still writing. Given this bull market that we've been experiencing on Wall Street and how long it's continued, how is CalPERS faring now? The big crisis came when we had the financial crisis and the market dropped substantially. Is CalPERS beginning to recover, and how does what CalPERS is doing now factor into the performance projections that you've put together?
So CalPERS recovered, but it never had, can't really fully recover because it lost so much that its base is gone. So now it's starting from a lower base. Mm-hmm. So even though, you know, it was, 1 year it had an 18% recovery, growth, but that's not something that has been, usually it's about 7% or around 7% over, 20 years. CalPERS doesn't always follow what the market's doing. It really depends on their asset mix. So, they don't have, especially now as they're going to lower risk investments, you're not necessarily seeing, if there's a bull market, it's not at that level. The first 6 months, or the first 6 months of last fiscal year was not a good time for CalPERS, but I know they've recovered slightly, or they have recovered over the past few months when the market's been doing better. We don't know what the amount is. We're not going to know until June or July what the annual return has been. But what we've done is we have assumed a 6.5%. We've assumed a little bit of a more conservative return on investment. So all of our numbers and all of these numbers are including a 6.5% return on investment instead of the 7% that CalPERS is including. So again, that's the good thing about having our independent actuary putting in other numbers.
Right. And it's when CalPERS adjusts that percentage, that's when we really experience pain.
Yeah, so CalPERS adjusted their percentage recently and took it down from 7.5% to 7%, and this is the reason why you can see those big jumps in the first few years. We're in, I think, year one of an 8-year ramp up that's going to be ending in 24-25, where they're going to keep ramping up to show the discount rate decrease. So obviously we have to contribute more because we're not expecting that we're going to get more from the market. And then that's one of the reasons why it starts to go down. The blue line starts to go down later.
Okay, very good. That's helpful. You mentioned that on your pie chart slide,
Yeah.
parking revenues declining starting there is one of the bigger numbers at 10% of the total. So what do we know about what's really behind that? Is this the impact of price increases that we've put in place? Is it demand that's changing because of rideshare? Is it because of an increase in the number of EVs on the street? Do we have a good assessment as to kind of what's going into those figures?
Okay, Henry is here, but
Yeah.
from what I understand, it is a lot of it has to do with Expo, rideshare, different modes of transportation.
Okay. Yeah, I'd be interested in the degree that we have more analysis on that. I appreciate it might not be at your fingertips now.
Yes.
But understanding how that's changing has a lot of implications for us when it's 10%
Yes.
of our revenues. Similarly
Absolutely.
with internet or with sales taxes, the effect obviously, as the city manager mentioned, of internet sales, and it's different. But how do I think about what the difference is, and what are we seeing in the shift? Are we expecting more of this to change? Are there offsetting considerations that we ought to take a look at? What can we do to
In
try
terms
to
of
affect
sales
this?
taxes, we're not expecting it to get better.
Right.
And this is where it's up to us to start thinking about different types of revenue sources and not counting on sales tax unless there's a big, our services aren't charged sales tax right now, and that's a big policy shift that would have to happen at the state level. So not much in terms of sales tax is under our control. Where we will have control, our hotel taxes, our business license tax, our utility
Right.
users tax, those are local. That's where we have control. Those are the taxes that we have come back to the city. And we have more control over those.
But when you say sales taxes, you're blending sales and use taxes.
Yes.
Right?
Yes, that's
And they do
also-
have different impacts based on where you live
Yes.
versus where you're purchasing.
Our transaction and use tax is a little bit different. So if someone from Santa Monica goes to LA to buy a car in LA, we still get the transaction and use tax off of that car.
Right. And so opportunities to increase use taxes versus sales taxes would be a helpful thing. It sounds like it's not within our control, but certainly within our lobbying interest.
Yes, and we actually can't increase our use tax any more
Right.
than what we've done. We're up to the limit at 2%.
But shifting what is a use tax, where a use tax is
Could be
applies
applied,
versus a
yeah.
sales tax could be something that would be of interest to us. But at the Sacramento level,
Yes.
maybe we have council members who are involved in equalization, Board of Equalization, I don't know. Okay, that covers my questions, thanks.
Councilmember McEwen.
Gigi, right at the beginning of your presentation, you said that a quarter of our budget, 25%, is capital improvement programs. Now, I realize that's one-time money,
Right.
and that deferring capital improvement sometimes could make it more expensive in the long run, but it's 25% of the budget. So what is the appropriate way for us to evaluate reining in some of our capital improvement aspirations?
So our capital, let me be a little bit more specific about that. It's 25% citywide. In the general fund, it's 16%. And in other enterprise funds, it's about 35%. And why is that? Because Big Blue Bus buys big buses. And we have solid waste vehicles and things like that that cost money. We also, I believe in those numbers, we've included the water, the sustainability and wastewater, the SWIP project and things like that. So not everything is coming from revenues. Not everything is coming from tax revenues for sure, but a lot of it is coming from, some low interest loans that we're getting from the state for water and things like that. We, on the general fund side, we do a very good job of reining in our capital project expenditures because we try to hold, well, in almost all cases, we hold ourselves to an amount that we set aside from revenues every year, which is about $21 million. And we have a committee made up of department heads in the city, and we work very hard to see where we can leverage other money. Prop A funds, development agreement funds that that are for discrete purposes, so that we can keep our our CIP funding pretty steady. One of the things that's happening with our CIP funds is we are a lot of it, more and more of it, is going towards equipment replacement. So we have our fleet, which we just did a fleet utilization study on to make sure that that is held back, that we have our equipment, that we have our network throughout the city that we need to, and our servers that we need to update, and just in general, maintenance. So it's
So a
not
lot of
just
that
all
is
new
not
buildings.
volitional. I mean, that's just stuff we have to do.
Yes, a lot of it is, it's almost ongoing. It's not big new buildings, that $21 million.
Now, the other side, beside expenditures, of course, is revenue. And when we talked earlier about taxes, Rick pointed out that most taxes are to some extent regressive, and they have the danger of impacting our middle class and those even less well-to-do. But one of the biggest chunks on your pie chart was hotel taxes. And we're a city with 85 to 90% occupancy of our hotel rooms, some of which are going for over $500 a night. And I don't think our TOT is the highest in the state or even the region.
That's correct.
Of course, we have to go to voters with it.
Yes.
And there might be a campaign against it from those who would feel that it would hurt their business. But how much room do we have there to do an increase, and what would the yield be if we did increase the TOT by, say, 1%?
So I think that, so we're at 14% right now, and I think that we have room for 1%, potentially more, before we're actually hitting up against what the highest is for other cities. We also have a TMD, Tourism Marketing District fee that is assessed on top of the 14%.
But that's being used to promote
Santa
hotels.
Monica, yeah.
So I mean, we're encouraging that this be a long-term investment. We've long ago decided that tourism was a fairly clean way to generate revenue for the city. I'm just wondering, how could we maximize the revenue we're generating? And I don't think you gave me a dollar figure on what that percent would yield. Do you?
About $5 million.
So not
For
enough to
1%.
solve our problem, but certainly
Right.
a significant part of the solution should we choose to go that way. And that we couldn't do until, I assume, 2020. It would have to be on the same ballot as the election.
That's
for
correct.
at least some of the council members. So
Yes.
it would be November of 2020.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Councilmember Moreno.
Hi, thank you.
Hi.
All right, a few questions. So the 10-year forecast, obviously we've been in a incredible up cycle, but typical cycles are like 6 up, 1 down. So how does that translate into what you forecasted here?
So our baseline is showing just business as usual with our regular flattening revenues. The yellow line is showing the moderate recession, where we would be seeing some decreases in, revenues that are kind of our economic indicators, our hotel taxes, our sales taxes, business license taxes.
Okay. So would the yellow line then fall into that 6 up, 1 down cycle? Would that be considered a moderate trajectory?
It's 1 down, and I don't know that we have a 6 up and another down, but we're pretty much seeing it as what would be happening if it's been way further than 6.
Clearly,
Right.
this time. Yeah,
So
yeah, anomaly.
we're just showing it's a down,
Right.
and we're not doing another one at that point.
Got it. So does the chart represent the flattening? So after year 4, whatever, it goes back into some sort of
Yeah.
moderate
Well,
6 up
yeah.
or flattening, and that smooths out. Okay. I just wanted to understand the graph. And I've started hinting around, and I've bumped into it on the audit commission a bunch of times. Is there any vehicle facility where we can fix our pension obligation? The largest factor in all of this is CalPERS. And I know pension obligation bonds are risky. I know the 115s are risky. There's risk all over the place. But is there some sort of fixed vehicle that we can wrap into this thing that will set our long-term mortgage rate?
No.
Sorry.
This is the best,
For all
I
of
mean,
us.
this is what we did in the
Yeah.
Pension Advisory Committee, and what was in the information items, that we looked at all of these things. The 115 trust isn't risky, it's just not really, doesn't really provide any greater benefit, and continues to have pretty much the same risk that CalPERS has, because it's driven by the market.
No, it's just more flexible.
Right.
Things like service costs or service fees. When you're evaluating, I know the new ERP system will help this, but when you're looking at individual departments, do you look at service fees that cover costs? So like net zero in different business units across the city outside
We
of
do
the
a cost
enterprise
allocate,
fund?
when we do our fee study every couple
Yeah.
years, we pretty much zero base everything to see how much the overhead is on everything, so that we start off with full cost recovery, and
Yeah.
then there are certain policies throughout the city. A lot of our youth or recreation our programs in community and cultural services don't have full cost recovery, but other areas do. So, and sometimes the council votes to not have full cost recovery on certain areas. For example, solar panels and things like that
Yeah.
don't have the same cost recovery as others.
Got it. So do you call them cost recovery units, or how do you identify them within, let's say, the general fund, where one unit or one department has a full cost recovery?
It's just basically our cost allocation.
Okay.
It's part of our fee study.
Got it. Thank you. And then last, I know the next part of it will get into sort of revenue strategies. But things like the new online sales tax, I think that just came out. Is that going to help us? Will that offset some of our?
We're not expecting to see big changes. We already receive, Amazon, which is one of the biggest,
Yeah.
has been paying sales tax. So we're not really expecting to see much of a difference. Maybe a little bit, but not much of a difference. Anything that's online goes into a state pool,
Yeah.
and we get a portion of it, not what would come necessarily straight to Santa Monica, but based on what proportion of the total sales tax the city gets from statewide, and then we get it apportioned to us that way.
Got it. Okay. And then my last question is, how much, or do you have any interaction with like the economic development department? And when you're thinking about revenue strategies, how much cross pollination?
Oh, we
is there?
work very closely
Yeah?
together.
Okay. Great. Thank you.
Councilmember Hara.
you mind if I take a follow-up on that?
Okay.
So the internet sales tax, what you were just describing is that the way it's collected is at the state level, and then it's apportioned based on your share as a city of other sales taxes. So does the brick and mortar sales tax then drive the internet sales tax revenue we
Yes.
receive? Mm-hmm. So they are still kind of related, and while we're seeing declines, now I'm a little lost as to how much it's affecting it.
Well, because it's still,
Still less.
what used to come to us, it's just a different level. I mean, if you have City of LA or some other cities, or very small cities that just have, that are all sales tax,
Right.
they actually drive that more. It's a smaller percentage
Than what we would expect
than what
if
we
we
would
were
expect.
actually doing
Yeah,
sales in our
based on
stores.
who's shopping from here.
Right.
Buy local. Councilmember Hara.
Hi, good evening. I only have one question,
Okay.
and if we're talking about the faster pay down of the existing liability, you mentioned that the 13-year would yield us a savings of $106 million.
Yes.
What would a 14-year give us?
I have that. 83 million.
Thank you.
All right, I have a couple of questions. So first of all, talking a bit about revenues, just want to make sure that I understand what's in the charts that you've shown us. The revenues that you're projecting are revenues based on what already exists in terms of our revenue stream, is that right?
Yes.
So, for example, as Councilmember O'Day and Morena, or Mayor Pro Tem O'Day and Morena, Councilmember Morena were talking about, you haven't like baked in any extra for the online sales tax.
No.
And in terms of things that we know may contribute to our bottom line but haven't come online yet, like, say, the Proper Hotel, which at least I understand is opening later this year sometime, maybe later this month. Well, I guess maybe it's not May 1st yet. We don't, like, have that in there yet, do we?
Well, this is current year, so I don't believe that this is in this year's, it's next year, right? Yeah. So it's in, the Proper Hotel is in our forecast for 1920, but this is all based on 1819
Okay.
estimated actuals.
All right, great, thanks. And then I just want to back up because I want to make sure that everyone's clear. When you mentioned that if a community, that if PERS went under, or a community couldn't make the payments to PERS, that PERS would reduce benefits to the community. And I don't want to ascribe evil motives to anyone, but there might be some people in Santa Monica who goes, then why would we pay down our liability? Let's just not pay, and then we'll get a reduced funding. But the problem is the city has to make up the difference in the owed pension liability. Isn't that right?
Yes.
So not paying down the pension, even if PERS says, well, fine, we're going to cut your benefits, doesn't cut the cost to us.
No.
Because we still have to make up the difference.
That's right.
Okay, I just wanted to make that clear because I think some people might have said, whoa, there's an
Yes.
outlet. And then the other question I had is about taxing services. What are our options, if any, there?
Well, I think this is something that legislators have brought up in Sacramento, and I don't know that it's there. I don't know that there's been a lot of push for it recently, but that's definitely something that I would be up for. I think that it's something that I think that we should continue to support.
Okay, well, I mean, I understood there were some state impediments to
Yes.
that and that they weren't being moved, but it is something that maybe we as a community can lobby more heavily for.
I agree.
Okay, great, thank you. All right, that concludes the questions for this portion. I think Ms. Lichtig, you're up next.
Thank you, Mayor and council members. I wanted to give you an overview of our approach to the coming two-year biennial budget. This is taking into consideration and going back to the question of engagement. 3,700 people engaged in our budget survey. Over 800 people came to one of our pop-ups. and we've had 26,000 impressions about our budget process so far to date. This has been a transformative effort that has engaged many of our staff members, many community members, and many of our commissions. I wanted to take the opportunity to thank you for allowing us to engage in this process. It is one that has caused us to extend our muscle memory in terms of really trying to reimagine how we do the budget. It's required new thinking and a lot of blood, sweat, and maybe just a couple tears here and there. The people who are in this room deserve a lot of the credit for the advancement of the efforts that we've made. Thank you for acknowledging that earlier, and I just wanted to take the opportunity to acknowledge that as well. In the short-term budget plan for the next 2 years, we plan to either cut spending or increase revenues to the tune of about $7.5 million in the first year. That's through increased revenues, efficiencies, restructuring, and phasing out some low-impact activities. We've also thought boldly about the long-term changes, and Rick is going to talk to those. In the first budget cycle in 1921, it identifies small ways to achieve ongoing savings. And across the board in all funds, it's $7.5 million and $3.4 million in the second year. It's important to recognize that you can't just go to this year's numbers and then take those numbers off, because there's a lot of ups and downs. And so when we do present the budget, you'll get the full picture of how that's impacting our next year's budget. In all funds, we've identified $5.8 million of ongoing expenditure savings in the first biennial. And again, we'll be exploring multiple ways of making changes to the way we do business and what businesses we invest in to close the budget gap over the long term. It includes the 13-year pay down, which is, again, over $100 million worth of savings. And it maintains our investments in combating crime and keeping Santa Monica safe. We felt that was important to highlight because of the changes that we've experienced on our streets. We are making progress in terms of bringing crime down, but over the course of the last couple of years, we felt that that investment was important to continue. So in terms of closing the general fund budget gap, I wanted to talk a little bit about how those were split up between reductions or reductions in expenditures and then revenues. 24% represents, which represents $1.5 million, needs to be added to this picture in order for us to continue to have a balanced budget over the long term. On page 22 of your staff report, it outlines the budget efficiencies, the savings in the first year and the second year. And I won't reiterate all of those in detail, but I just wanted to point out that there is detail in your staff report as it relates to this breakdown. Again, the to be determined 24% is that $1.5 million. We have made investments in our framework priorities. Unfortunately, because of our financial situation, there is not a lot of new money going towards anything in the budget and going towards anything in our framework priorities. But we do have significant investments going on in each of the priority areas. And that's all funds that are represented up on the slide that represents it. We are investing and continuing our commitment to addressing homelessness by adding additional money to the new investments of homelessness priority, by investing in our C3 teams to cover the beaches and other high-impact public places, and also to bring the outreach to 7 days a week from 5 days a week. It's extending the leadership role of the Senior Advisor on Homelessness, as well as the LSOs and some other efforts in our library to keep that a safe place. We're also investing in our affordability priority by enhancing our expanding the preservation of diversity, or our POD program. The investments and efficiencies that are outlined here try to summarize where we're making investments and where we're making efficiencies. So on the 21st century city and government investments, we're investing in our digital city hall and our website. This is also going to be a platform for 24-hour, 7-day-a-week services. And so we have process automations, both internally and externally, that we're planning to build into our website, as well as embed in our day-to-day operations. And so you'll see when you get the budget on May 23rd is the goal, because the 25th is a Saturday. It's my anniversary, so that's why I know what date it is. So when you see it, you'll see there's a contract management system so that we can fully automate the way that we process contracts within the city. Right now, we've started the process of automating it, but there are a lot of people walking around with a lot of hard copies of contracts. And so we really do look forward to the opportunity to have a 21st century contract management program. And then a lot of the automated services that people want to get by not coming down to City Hall will be embedded in potentially some in the first phase of the website rollout, and then continuing that effort. On the operating investments, we need to continue to maintain the existing facilities, parks, city buildings, and so there'll be investments in city buildings. Workplace safety, City Hall is a wonderful place to work and visit, but we also want to make it a safe place to work and visit, and so there are enhancements to workplace safety, and then the homelessness investments that I already mentioned. On the efficiency side, we're streamlining some of our business practices. We're combining similar work across departments or divisions. We've taken a hard look at the contract scopes and the work assignments of staff to reflect the priority workloads. And so, as an example, we're foregoing consumer price index or CPI, not only within city departments, but we're holding the line with our social service agencies. We're aligning our programs and making them right-sized, and so that includes working with the school district to modify the CREST program as it relates to AM care, late start, and the PM extended care program. And then we're trying to capture our actual costs of doing business. And so that includes building in credit card costs, which we've never done before, to make sure that those expenses are covered, as well as making sure that the parking rates are appropriate, and then charging and eliminating the subsidy to the LA Marathon as an example. And on that note, I'm going to turn it over to Rick, who's going to talk about the long-term plans, and then we'll take questions.
Bless you.
Oh, that wasn't good. So we've talked about revenues, and there are, again, a couple of kinds of revenues. There's enhancing our existing revenues, and then there's creating new revenues, and then there's taxes. So we do think that this is an important part of our future. However, it's important to recognize, as Councilmember McEwen noted, that any changes legally will have to wait until November of 2020. So there'll be an opportunity over the next year and a half to think about what, if any, changes in our existing taxes or new taxes need to go to the voters. It might be none, might be more than one, might be an adjustment to our existing taxation, or might be a new source of revenue. So we can talk more about that as we move forward. Then this is something I want to again reemphasize. On the list of potential efficiencies for year 2 of the first cycle and for the second and third cycles, we really want to, just because we make a decision to move in a particular direction doesn't mean we have to do it at the next July 1st, right? We might make a decision that we would phase in over 2 years or over 3 years or 4 years. That would take advantage of staff attrition as people retire. That would take advantage of the opportunity to have any mitigation of any impacts on the community. So we're thinking about the second cycle. That's over 2 years away. But during that 2 years, if we make some decisions, then when we get to this time 2 years from now, we'll already be on a glide path to a balanced budget. As Gigi pointed out with that chart of the many lines, if we achieve that $2.5 million, along with the $1.5 million in the first biennial, we will be able to balance the following 2 years, even without additional revenue. And there are some savings that we think may fall to us as we continue to digitize, and the things that Katie was mentioning, as well as some other, restructurings and consolidations that might take place. But when we look to beyond the next biennial, to the third biennial, there'll still need to be either additional revenues or additional expense reductions in that third. But this gives us enough time that if we stay on this plan, we're good for 4 years. And if we're good for 4 years, that will set us up, hopefully, to make the changes during that 4 years that will make sure we're good for 6 and beyond. So if we're successful at hammering out with you and with the community a realistic plan for not only this biennial but for the next, what success looks like 6 years from now is that we're living within our means. Santa Monica's been extraordinarily advantaged by that. It's allowed us to break ground on a soccer field this summer. It's allowed us to put significant investment in our buildings and facilities, and replacing park restrooms, and keeping up with our street pavement, and keeping up with our water investments, and being on the cutting edge of recapturing stormwater and wastewater. Being in good financial shape allows us to do things that other communities can't do. And so what we want to be in 6 years is to still be in that situation. 6 years from now, we'll have paid off a big chunk of our unfunded liability, saving this community scores of millions of dollars over the next 30 years, as we've pointed out. We will have a smaller city workforce, but that city workforce will be extraordinarily well-trained. They'll have the best equipment, they'll have the latest technology, and they'll be working, we believe, in significantly enhanced facilities. We're building a new fire station and rehabbing a couple of our old ones. City Services building opens a year from now, serving the community and our own workforce. And we will be bringing you this summer the plan to make some substantial upgrades in our city yards, which will also create efficiencies down the road on the services that impact our community. So ultimately, if we're successful, we will have 6 years from now a government that not only costs less, but actually a government that works better for the 93,000 people who live here. With that, I think we'll just talk about the next steps and then turn it over to you for questions. We are going to now finish putting together the budget book that will come out on May 23rd. Thank you for the correction. And then the council and the community will have a chance to go through that. We'll be doing the outreach that you talked about to the community so people understand what's in it. And then you'll have 2 evenings to get into the depth of the budget plan. And then we hope we'll bring you back answers to any questions that come up during those 2 days to allow you to adopt the budget by the June 25th council meeting, which you're legally required to come to adopt a budget by July 1. So just reviewing, this is what we set out to do. And over the last 2 hours, we hope we've reviewed the framework and strategy for maintaining fiscal balance over the next decade. We've reviewed the approach we're taking to the budget that I'll be recommending to you in May. And we've referenced that this is part of a much longer, well thought out orderly effort to focus our resources on priorities, to create a 21st century government, to invest in our workforce, and to better serve our community. With that, Katie and I will take questions.
I don't see any questions. Oh, we have a latecomer. Councilmember McEwen.
I assume we have some people who want to speak on
Yes, we
what we've
do.
heard tonight, and even though we're not on KCRW, I'm sure there are people who will be catching this on City TV. So because there are some things in the staff report that were not touched on, some of them were, and because some of the media coverage didn't make it clear that the council has to consider all these things, none of these decisions have been made yet. If I could, Rick, I wanted to do a lightning round with you and just go down a list of about a dozen things that are in the staff report and get a very quick summation of what it is that you are about to suggest to us for consideration. The first thing would be charging a credit card fee.
As you know, when credit card transactions are made, there's a 2 or 3% surcharge. We'd be recapturing that through our fee structure.
So it'd be about 2%, 2 or 3%. Cutting our broadcast on KCRW, which I think goes back to when KCRW was actually run by college students.
Correct. They only broadcast between particular hours. They only broadcast regular meetings, and then those are preempted occasionally by their fund drives. It's a kind of an iconic way in which these deliberations have been broadcast to all of Southern California, and we all know people that have caught glimpses of government in Santa Monica. But given that we're primarily serving our community, and there are multiple ways for our community to not only hear but to watch our meetings, we think that the cost of that outweighs the benefits.
And again, I'll remind you lightning round because I really do want to hear from the public. Adjusting our parking rates, is that beyond what the council's already authorized?
No.
Okay. Reducing the number of free minutes downtown.
That's for future consideration. We went from 2 hours to 90 minutes. There are very few places anymore on the west side of Los Angeles where you get any free parking. So we'd be potentially shrinking from 90 minutes to 60 minutes. We recognize that will be controversial, but we are committed to creating a new model of mobility, and giving away parking is not congruent with that.
Just your mention of that has the phones ringing already. So, reducing the hours of our recreational facilities.
It's very similar to the Big Blue Bus. It's the hours where we have very little usage.
Fewer seascapes.
Not in the first year, but in the second year, we're seeing a move away from print, and unfortunately some of our seascapes end up in the bin of junk mail. So even though we think it's a great resource for the people who read it, less and less people are actually reading it.
Eliminating the discretionary permits for mixed-use housing.
You find yourselves in a bind, and probably will be in a tighter bind in the future, as the state says that if a housing proposal meets your rules, you really have very little discretion. So going through the hearing process may be cathartic for people, but it doesn't produce much change.
Saving in staff time, is that what the benefit?
Saving staff time and complying with state law.
Focusing our Wi-Fi deployment on certain parts of town.
Yeah, there was a time when this was groundbreaking, that you could get free Wi-Fi. With the advent of 5G. Wi-Fi is becoming ubiquitous, and depending on what plan you have. So I think we would focus on areas where, from equity standpoint, we want our libraries and our city parks to continue to have that, but not necessarily commercial districts.
Civilianizing our fire inspection.
There's no question that there's value in having sworn firefighters put their eyes on the buildings and the facilities that get inspected. That is not the norm in Southern California. And so we would take a look at whether some or all of our sworn personnel would be replaced by attrition with civilians at significant savings.
The staff report talks about extending salary steps. I wasn't quite sure what that meant.
Sure.
Reducing the hierarchical 10% between an employee and the supervisor, or meant something else, or both?
We have a very rigid civil service and compensation plan, so that if you pass probation and meet expectations, in almost every case, you get an automatic 5% increase at the end of your first year, second year, third year, fourth year, and fifth year. That's a 25% increase automatically in 5 years. And then you reach the top, and then you're sort of stuck there. What we would have to clearly negotiate with representation, because this is clearly falls in that category, is perhaps for new staff members stretching that out to 6 years or 7 years or 8 years, so that maybe you get a 4%, rather than.
I've been on the council for 20 years. I never got those increases. Changes to the after-school programs.
Again, there's both short-term and long-term. The short-term are ones where we have potentially trimming some areas of low usage. Long-term, we have in our community the CREST program, which operates at our elementary schools. We have the Police Activities League, which operates out of Memorial Park, serving our whole community. We have recreation programs after school at Virginia Avenue Park and other facilities. We have a Boys and Girls Club, which also serves the community. And the question is, what's the best configuration of those resources so that they reach the kids who need those services at an affordable price or free in the places where they're most likely to benefit from it. That may be at their elementary school or their middle school. That may be at a city facility. That may be at a nonprofit. But that's what we're talking about, is a thoughtful convening of all of those entities to figure out what's the best way to serve our community. Let me be very clear. We are not interested in reducing the coverage. In fact, we hope we could enhance it. The question is whether the current configuration, which is kind of grown without any great coordinated planning, is there a way to coordinate that effort and save costs so that we can invest those costs or those savings into better care, as well as saving dollars for the city.
And lastly, in the lightning round, this one you mentioned, sponsorships and naming rights for events and facilities. I mean, you talked about,
Sure.
I guess, having copper tone on the beach trash cans.
Sure.
I think we actually used to. And we decided to go away from that.
Yeah, I mean, our big blue buses have advertising. The world has not stopped.
The Breeze bicycles have Hulu.
We have public service advertising on our trash trucks. There are ways in which, and we have, again, the Hulu bikes, as you said.
But will this become the Chase Bank City Council chamber? I mean,
that would be up to you.
so you're opening the door to the concept, but again, none of these has been decided. That, I think, was one of the misapprehensions that might have come out of some of the media coverage. These are not in the budget yet. They are things you are suggesting to us to consider, and they may be in the budget at the end of June.
There are three categories. There are things that will be in the budget. There are things that will be in the budget for future consideration in year 2, and there are things that will be in the budget for considerations in years 3, 4, 5, and 6.
All of which will have public hearings and a council vote.
In fact, multiple opportunities for the second and third categories. There'll be an opportunity for the departments to weigh in. There'll be opportunities for the task force to weigh in. There'll be opportunities for the council to weigh in, as well as the public along all that.
Thank you.
Councilmember Winterer.
So this is actually a question for the mayor, because I'm a little unclear where we're headed in this. We have the public waiting to speak, and then they speak and we're done? Or I, like Councilmember McEwen, has some questions and potentially comments on some of the things that he just addressed. But should we go to the public now and then get back to this, or I just wondered
Yes,
what you were thinking.
So I think our plan is, once we finish the questions round, and we should limit ourselves to questions, then we'll hear from the public, and then as we would with other items, I think we could have broader discussion and comments, because I think I certainly have some comments on both the staff report and some of what was produced, and I suspect you all do as well. So, but I want to get the questions out and then give the public an opportunity to speak, and then we can comment on it.
All right, then I will continue to pepper Mr. Cole with just a few more questions. If I can get my thoughts organized here. There was a mention in evaluating the role and structure of the hazmat program.
Mm-hmm.
Is that what the fire department does, or is that the recycling of hazardous waste at doorsteps?
Well, it could be both, but what we're specifically, we have our own local hazmat program, which has been a helpful backup. But as we think regionally, there may be opportunities to take advantage of efficiencies regionally, because we don't have a lot of call for that, but we need it when we need it.
So that would be the fire department. That
Correct.
basically is what you're after.
But again, we don't want to put a straitjacket. If there are ways in which we can find efficiencies that are broader than that, we would be open to exploring that.
And on the same note, what do you mean by assessing alternative staffing strategies in the fire department?
So we've had a rising call for services in the fire department, and we have to meet that challenge as we continue to grow as a community and as our demand for services grow. So the chief is committed to a coverage standard of cover study, where the fire stations go, how many vehicles we have, what kind of vehicles we have, how they are staffed. That's something that we need to take a look at over the next 6 years. Could there be savings? Not entirely clear, but we've got to get the right people as quickly as possible to where they're needed. And frankly, there are parts of the city that are less well served given traffic patterns, and we would like to take a comprehensive look at how to best utilize our fire department resources to have the maximum impact on both time of response time, as well as getting the right resources to the right problems.
Okay, and then there's a notion of scheduling public hearings during working hours.
Mm-hmm.
Would that mean the council would meet at lunchtime now? Because that might be a bit of a challenge.
You don't hold that many public hearings. We have things like, we have a number of hearings that take place in the evening hours, and of course that's to better serve the public. But then that means we have to make up for staff who are hourly, then get overtime pay, and staff who are salaried often get an adjustment in their schedule, which affects our productivity. So it's take a look at, are there some cases where primarily the folks coming are not the community, but for example, folks who are coming in here for various kinds of permits.
So give me just an example of one of those public hearings. I mean, it'd be...
I don't have an example off the top of my head.
All right, well then we can come back to that. And then tell me a little bit more about allocating more design review work to the staff level rather than at the ARB.
Sure. We only, the ARB is very staff intensive because we prepare for the 5 members of the ARB to make decisions. They don't always have a quorum because of, sometimes there are vacancies. So sometimes cases get continued. That's both slows down the process of being able to get a restaurant in business, for example, but also means a fair amount of staff time, which means very high fees. So a lot of that really, if we have good codes, it shouldn't be that subjective. It should be able, you met the code, you get a permit, and it's the staff's job to see that you met the code.
All right, those are my questions. Thank you.
Councilmember Himmelrich.
Yeah, I have a little follow-up to that, not too much. And one of them is the subsidies for events, and that appears a couple times here. And I know you and I have talked about the idea of the staff time that goes into events that's silent because we don't keep track of it, and therefore it's not allocated to all.
I want to be sure we're not talking about the city-sponsored events that would include Twilight on the Pier. If so, we need to hold that discussion.
I did not say that. I'm staying with the general thing, like the marathon.
Fair enough.
I think we'd prefer to move those to a future meeting.
Okay. Then I guess what that leaves me with is public safety dispatchers. And I don't know if you've addressed that or whether you're talking about changing our dispatch system, which was changed just a few years ago.
We have a unique system that has some advantages and some disadvantages. It's unique in that we have consolidated police and fire independent of either agency. The city has experimented with other structures. The most important thing is not who's the boss or whether it's regional or local. The most important thing is, are we getting excellent service and dispatch that protects public safety and the safety of our sworn personnel who are dispatched. So again, not talking about any immediate dramatic shift, but to again take a look at what is the best model for delivering that service and the most cost-effective for delivering. That is an extraordinarily stressful job. One of the things that we're lucky to have is, for the first time in a long time, we have a full complement of dispatchers, which is it's a very tough job, and the margins for error are very tiny.
And on the autonomous vehicles, one of the things that occurs to me as I look at the decline in parking revenues and discussion of autonomous vehicles, rideshare, et cetera, is how much our decline in parking is attributable to the cars that are just cruising around looking for people to take a ride in them, and what we can do about offsetting the parking revenues with that, if anything.
Well, that was one of the examples of, if I'm interpreting you correctly, that was one of the examples of a potential revenue measure. We referenced that San Francisco is moving in that direction. The question, of course, is enforcement and legality, right? How would you charge someone who starts in Venice and ends in Santa Monica, or who starts in Santa Monica and ends in Culver City? I'm sure that the TNCs would be very concerned about how we allocate that, but it's something we think, because it does clog our streets, it does have an impact on our community. We should consider whether it should be they should contribute to our city.
Thanks, and I will have more later, but thank you for those answers.
Thank you to the city. Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, I do have one question, and it came up in your response to Councilmember Himmelrich. So we've all heard the phrase, sometimes you have to spend money to make money. Mm-hmm. And I'm just wondering, how are we doing these cost savings analysis? Because it may be that sometimes we need to invest in something in order to save money down the road. I mean,
No
technology is perhaps the perfect example, but there are many others. And I want to make sure, because I think sometimes, and I'll use an example from my background, is it's been very difficult to get school districts to invest in early childhood education, even though everybody knows that if you have good early childhood education, your costs in special ed and in other kinds of school-related expenses in the upper grades goes way down. And so are we thinking at that sort of advanced level that maybe, I mean, I'm just worried that we're so focused on cutting costs that we may be cutting opportunities as well. So I'm wondering can you describe how we're analyzing that cost reduction and the cost benefit analysis?
Again, I don't want to oversell our analytical capacity. We have some very bright people on our staff, and they work very hard. But they're analyzing 668 different activities, right? Not all equally, but we try to focus their efforts where they'll have the biggest impact. That's again why I think a task force will be helpful. I think that will help augment that, and there may be some creative ways that we can tap into, for example, academic resources. We have used student resources very well. Our performance staff has really been, we have one person working on performance for the whole city, but Tim has recruited some of the brightest people from USC and UCLA to come and be interns, and they've just done an extraordinary job, and they're paid very little for the contribution that they make.
Great, thank you. It seems to end the question, so I think we'll go to the public comment now, if that's all right.
And may I thank the council for very thoughtful questions, and that this will help us frame the budget presentation in June.
Don't thank us till you've heard the comments, too. All right, we are going to begin the public hearing, so I will call up a few names so people can line up against the wall to your left, my right. First, we're going to have Dolores Sloan and Barry Rosenbaum speaking on behalf of the Landmarks Commission, so they will get 5 minutes. Then after that, Denise Barton, Leila Taslimi, Nina Fresco, and Carol Lemline.
Good evening. Chair Pro Tempore Rosenbaum will be with me, and we're both here to tell you how much the Landmarks Commission appreciates the intensive efforts of the council in this budgetary process, and you're grounding it in priorities and values which we do support. And it's really awesome to see the community-wide effort that's taking place beyond the council and the city staff. You already have 2 letters from us since the inauguration of this process. So you are aware of our priorities for the next 2 fiscal years and the specific budgetary requests to help meet them. So I won't itemize them because you do have them, but I do want to explain something, or at least bring it to everyone's attention, that we are now more shall we say, in partnership with the community than ever in the way that we initiate applications. And the community has not let us down. In 2018, we saw an increase in applications for landmarks designations from property owners as well as residents and members of community and neighborhood organizations. So our requests that we've made in our letters to you are based on the need to serve this population, which has become really very active partners. And we would do this through brochures and upgrades online so that these folks have more information on how to be effective in what they are doing. To put it simply, it's community education. So to do that, we need printed materials. We need to make upgrades online. And we, aside from that, we want to be sure that we can have an annual retreat, a meaningful one, so we can do serious strategic planning, which can never take place at the end of our meetings where the discussions come up, usually at 11:30 or midnight. Then we also want to upgrade the professional education opportunities that we have, so more of us can continue to be effective in our role by learning at these opportunities at conferences and workshops, then one thing that has been a priority is to fulfill the ordinance direction, which does tell us to provide plaques and other means of celebrating landmarks. And so we'd like to pay more attention to this. And we also see alternatives to plaques, such as QR, which is economical and less, shall we say, less involving of owners of property who may not wish to have plaques. And then finally, I want to say that I myself feel very encouraged by remarks that have been made here this evening regarding the community efforts to bring a preservation planner on board. And finally, I want to thank you really for what you're doing in basing everything on priorities and values. We see ourselves as in the priority of engaging the community and helping them to thrive, and we see ourselves in the value of taking care of this. So thank you, and do you have anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I actually wasn't planning to speak, but I guess I just want to briefly express our thanks to the city manager for his commitment that he expressed at the beginning of this meeting to establish a historic preservation planner position in the planning department. As he stated, this is reflective of the high priority that historic preservation has been accorded in the city. Establishment of this position has been under consideration on and off for decades, and we're so pleased that under this council and the city manager's leadership, this is going to come to fruition. So thank you very much for that.
All right, thank you, Ms. Sloan and Mr. Rosenbaum. Next, we have Denise Spartan.
Good evening. You've heard the saying, no matter how many times you say something doesn't make it true. An example of this would be the repetition of the insinuation that the city and city council have values. Would that be your special interest, your self-promotion, your financial interest, or the almighty dollar, which can be seen in the staff report at the top of page 12, where the chart shows your newfound values, at or near the bottom of the chart, showing what they really mean to you, that it's all for image. Or what about the repetitive phrase, framework for a sustainable city? Let's look at what that really means. From my experience, it means as long as your building meets LEED certification at time of opening, what changes are made after that which affect the sustainability of the building are of no concern to the city. Yet you continue sitting up there proclaiming that everything's so sustainable within the city. Of course, I'm referring to the non-drought resistant spider plants on the roof of my building, which the planning department has no problem with. Would that make your proclaiming a sham or a scam? And the city proclaims it's so greatly connected and engaged with the community. But if you're getting that by doing things that get more of a negative response, couldn't that be seen as abusive? Now let's go to page 17, where I believe the key phrase to all this is, putting greater stress on fund balances and or will drive greater rate increases, saying that City Hall has no intent of cutting its costs, but would rather sacrifice services to the community residents and children, which can be seen in the chart at the top of page 11, which I think, again, says it all. Just look at the cost of governance in comparison to the community. And why would you not think a cost of over $1 million a year per resident for the city's governance alone cannot be seen as a cost excessive, financially abusive, and financially irresponsible in a barely over 8 square mile city? Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Taslimi?
Mayor Davis, council members, city manager. Leila Taslimi representing Santa Monica's Early Childhood Task Force, and some members are here tonight. Others watch from home. We're hopeful council will provide clear direction to staff that you too continue to believe in a city that invests in children and families learning and thriving. Tonight we choose to bring your attention to the reference on page 14 of the staff report to an anticipated upcoming reimagining of the Human Services Grants Program to focus efforts on reducing homelessness following fiscal year 2019-21. Currently, the Human Services Grants Program funds the Whatever It Takes programs that strive to lift up our most vulnerable families and children through the YRT, Middle School YRT, and the Early Childhood Wellbeing Project. The Grants Program also funds Connections for Children and subsidizes quality early childhood care for low-income Santa Monica children, giving them a chance to realize your definition of equity, a city that provides all groups access to resources and opportunities, and where differences in life outcomes cannot be predicted by race, class, gender, or other identities. This council and past councils have understood and strongly supported learning as a means to achieve equity. We hope that you will make clear now and in the future your continued commitment to help Santa Monica's children and most vulnerable families thrive. We also ask that as your process moves forward to establish a task force, you include a community member with a strong record of involvement in the Cradle to Career Initiative, the Early Childhood Task Force, or our public schools. We look forward to listening tonight and to engaging with you in the process of shaping a budget and a future that reflect our shared values to serve the people of Santa Monica. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Teslimi. Ms. Fresco?
Good evening, everyone. I've heard some very good news. Thank you, Rick and David. I'm going to go for gold and say that I'm here to discuss adding historic preservation to the budget framework, which is something we've talked about before. I'm going to provide you with a little extra detail. We would like to see, in particular, that historic preservation metrics appear on the new online dashboard. I believe this exercise of formally tracking the preservation program will go far to maintain its effectiveness and credibility and ensure that the resources that are allocated to it are doing the job. The kinds of metrics that apply are quantitative changes resulting directly from activities or strategies of the program. I have a report by the International Academy of Public Administration that was created on behalf of the U.S. Department of the Interior National Park Service for their historic preservation program that identifies meaningful performance measures for historic preservation, many of which are very relevant to our program and use data we already have without digging very deeply at all. For example, the number of properties given historic designation in a year, or the number of undesignated properties listed on the HRI that have been altered contrary to the Secretary of Interior standards, and the inverse that tracks those were altered in compliance with the standards. We could also track the number of historic resources analyzed as part of a CEQA study for a project in the city for which no adverse impacts were found versus the number that were found to have adverse impacts that required mitigations, such as the ever disappointing photographic documentation or a statement of overriding considerations. While all this information and other data points have always been available to us, consolidating on them on this dashboard to hold us accountable to them will help the city to achieve our preservation goals. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Lemline, before you begin, I'm going to call the last few names. Elizabeth Vandenberg, David Morris, who has 2 minutes donated by Linda Myers. Is Ms. Myers here? Oh, okay, good. Sorry, I didn't see your hand right there. Mr. Morris, Judy Abdo, and then Dominic Bay.
Thank you. As most of you know, I am president of the Santa Monica Conservancy, and I considered not getting up to speak after the city manager Cole's earlier comment regarding a historic preservation specialist, but I thought it was worth pointing out that the elimination of inefficiency in that program could possibly be a model for improvements citywide in staffing. The preservation program currently occupies the equivalent of at least one full-time planning staff member, but the responsibilities are spread among several individuals, all of whom have other responsibilities in the planning department and must juggle among multiple priorities in an inefficient way. The current system of splintered responsibilities results in inefficient and excessive use of consultants, long delays in response to applications, and an increasing lack of satisfaction and loss of public confidence. Now, this is the Conservancy's observation that I was hoping to make you aware of, although I recognize that we have had the increase in applications, which the Landmark Commissioners made note of. Assigning a dedicated planning staff member focused on historic preservation would be a much more efficient approach and would facilitate development of the expertise necessary to manage the program efficiently. I think that this idea of more efficient application of duties could allow improvements of staff effectiveness in many other areas of the city government. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Vandenberg?
Oh, that thing's died. Okay. Oh, I see. How do I get this up? All right. I need this picture now. There you go. Okay, and then it goes down. Okay, sorry. Elizabeth Vandenberg, Wilmot, and good evening to Mayor Davis and the City Council members. I bring to you my concern regarding the intersection coming off of the Lincoln exit. In the budget framework, there's a sub-outcome of area called mobility and access, and is one of the City Council's 6th priority. And part of that is called safe driving, walking, biking, and transit, with a metric of 0 deaths and severe injuries, so 0 severe injuries. I'm very concerned about this exit because I've been taking it for about 40 years now. And what's going to happen with the development on Lincoln north of 10 is we're going to see many more cars coming down Colorado going east, coming right on 11th, and then this is Olympic Boulevard. And what we're going to see is a crossing of what I call the X. And people are going to come a lot quicker down Olympic. The people are going to try to come off the Lincoln exit and try to go north on Lincoln. And the people coming down could be either turning right, but they mostly are going to be turning left to get back on the freeway, go south on, or go south on Lincoln. I am very concerned that this is a serious traffic hazard. Having been on it every day for many years, I would request that the city look at it for budget expense in support of this outcome to make sure that we have 0 deaths and severe injuries. I believe this intersection is going to cause significant problems and wanted to bring that up to be more proactive than not. I would recommend, we gave $500,000 for the Vision Zero on Wilshire. I don't know if that's a benchmark, but I would definitely like this studied, and I'd like to do this before we see the Lincoln housing developments opened up and the traffic that I believe is going to be a severe issue here, and appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Morris?
Good evening, City Council, Mayor. I'd like to bring to your attention once again the need for a serious plan for homelessness in this city. Just the plan of having San Michelle, Turning Point, and Safe Haven, and a number of other transitional housing facilities for the families, children, and so on, and different domestic violence people, and so on and so forth, is not just going to be enough. We need to have some kind of shelter here, at least within the boundaries of Santa Monica, either on the border, wherever you want to put it, that will actually address the 400 people that sleep in the street every night in this city. Transitional housing facilities, most people never see the front door of that place that are homeless. A lot of the other people come in there and fail the program. They don't make it a month because they can't actually just comply with the situation in their life. My experience at San Michelle has been the worst experience I ever had in my life, and I think you'd probably agree if you lived there yourself. I brought a lot of things to your attention about the facility, and I'm hoping that the facility will be brought up to par and moved, rebuilt. But in the interim, the people that are sleeping on the street are not addressed by transitional housing. They're only addressed by some kind of a shelter. In the wintertime, we have the winter shelter on Federal, that's run by First to Serve that works for this area in Venice and West LA. But there's nothing dedicated to Santa Monica and the 400 people that are sleeping in the street every day. Until we address these issues of this facility that's needed, the problems with homelessness will never go away. They'll just be bigger and bigger and bigger year after year after year. There's no way of avoiding it. There's no way of escaping it. So I'm hoping that you guys will take from someone that has an experience for the last few years with homelessness, his advice that you could put something together for the homeless that's going to work. And then the community is going to be much, much happier with you guys and everybody, whoever's in office. So that being said, I want to thank the council. I want to thank the general public for having supported me through my transition here in San Michelle. I was exited recently, and I don't know what my future holds. That's yet to be seen. But this situation with these transitional housing facilities without city oversight over the program itself, some kind of checks and balances, is not working. If you look at the numbers and go through the situation, you'll find out that the people in those facilities, half of them don't make it through the program. The other half, they're exported somewhere. Even Santa Monicans are exported to South Central or Lancaster or somewhere else where their life doesn't exist. So they're expected to rebuild their life somewhere else. But in the meantime, the people that are on the street that have no shelter whatsoever, they're going to be on the sidewalks. They're going to be needing restrooms. They're going to be needing all kinds of facilities. If we don't supply that need with an answer, there's no success. 5 years, 10 years, it's going to be the same problem. And I want to thank you guys once again for giving me your time. Thank you very much. Have a good evening.
Thank you, Mr. Morris. Ms. Abdo?
Good evening. Once again, it's so wonderful to be down here and not up there for the budget discussions. I'm here representing the committee that was formed to look at the pension issues, to look at the unfunded liability issues. And so that's all I want to address. I do want to say there are a bunch of us here. This was a group that was brought together because of expertise of various people on the group, some of which really knew what the word Delta meant. Some of them were very, very conversant with their union contracts. And then there were some who were sort of more process people, like myself. So the two co-chairs are right here, me and Dom. And now we have everybody who was on the committee stand up. Okay.
Judy,
And
it
there
was
were
Matt
more.
that was your co-chair, you'll recall.
Oh, that's okay. Wrong person.
Wrong
Anyway,
uniform.
what I want to say is that it was very tempting to get into the budget issues, but we were told over and over and over that was not our job. Our job was to look at how to address the unfunded liability issue. And so that's what we ended up talking about for I can't even imagine counting up how many hours we were there. And it was I think, a huge learning experience for all of us. We came from very different places. I'm representing a group, so I should get more.
No, not an official commission, but good try, former Mayor
Oh,
Abdo.
okay, then let me just finish up by saying we came to a unanimous agreement, which is an amazing thing given how many of us had various points of view when we entered this process. And so I want to just put in front of you, we came to unanimous agreement on what would be the best thing for our city that we all love.
Thank you, Ms.
There we go.
Mr. Bay.
Mayor Davis, City Council, Rick, Katie, and all the fine folks that came out tonight and continue to do endless work for this city. We're grateful. My name's Dominic Bay. I represent the Santa Monica firefighters, and first I want to give credit to the city manager's office on taking on a very ambitious project. Making cuts in a time of economic expansion, it takes courage. So we tip our hat to that. I just want to address quickly the fact that while the budget seems a good place to prepare for the future, it's also a good place to address current deficiencies, issues that we're facing now. And we just don't want those to get overlooked during this time where we're making cuts. So I hope the council takes a hard look at current and new problems, because while the recession may come or may not, summer is coming for sure. The pier will be packed. The pier is one area that's a huge target hazard for us with some unaddressed challenges. There is no new money on the table for a lot of departments, fire included, and I think to not fund them is okay, but to not address the challenges that we have, to not say, hey, if we weren't making cuts, how could we make the pier a safer place? Maybe it's new having a presence down there, because right now we don't have a permanent presence at the pier. But we're not going to fund it now. We'll address it next year, and we'll get through this summer. But it's important, I think, to address those kind of items. Homelessness is huge for fire, and there's nothing really for us on the budget there. And additionally, response times are a constant challenge with areas of the city that we're starting to fall below our the national standards. So while we're looking on the budget for reductions, and I think it's 7 to eliminate 7 positions, sworn positions, I just hope that you guys take a look at kind of the consequences of those and looking at some of the challenges we're facing right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bay. That closes the public hearing, and the matter is now before the council. Councilmember Himmelrich.
So I'm going to go first because I need to go home early tonight. So that way I'm going to go and then I'm going to leave, but I'll listen to the rest on the radio and watch on TV. But I have
Yeah, we're not on the radio.
Okay,
this evening,
well,
so you'll have to watch.
I'll watch it on TV or listen to it on my phone, but I have to be in surgery at 6 a.m. tomorrow. So let me start with my general thanks to everybody for all of the work you've done and the progress you've made. I mean, I can only say that I've been on the audit subcommittee since its inception, and the strides we've made in terms of grappling with some of the financial issues in the city has been remarkable. And Gigi, I give you a lot of credit, but Rick and Katie, I give you a lot of credit too. So thank you for doing that. I am very focused on the revenue issues here. And I do think, and I understand that a lot of people have been assembled, but I do believe that there are possibly some ways that people in our community could help you in terms of cost savings with the departments. When I say people in our community, I see the list of people who are included on all of the committees, and I know you have outside experts, but I think that we all might benefit from tapping into some of the community resources, including the pension committee resources and other people who have experiences with various aspects of this. I know that I, for instance, did a remodel this year, and it only took about 8 months longer than it was supposed to. So, and I'm not blaming it all on the city, but I do think that it's a process that could be better. I don't quite know how, but I can tell you what the problems were. But now let me talk about the things I'd like to see with revenues. First of all, I've talked about a vacancy tax and a vacancy register before. I think we're seeing the erosion of life in Santa Monica in terms of people living here and businesses being here by the fact that landlords are willing to hold out for higher rents as long as they can. And there are buildings that have 4 residents and 20 vacancies. There are storefronts where anecdotally landlords will say, I'm waiting till I get my price. I think if we had a vacancy tax that was a meaningful tax, it would make a difference, and we wouldn't have the sorts of vacancies we have in both apartments and commercial properties today. The tax on luxury properties for sale and purchase, again, I think that we have a problem. A lot of those properties aren't occupied. This is not anecdotal. There are buildings on Ocean Avenue when literally less than half of the units have full-time residents, and the rest of them are pied-à-terres or other kinds of accommodations for people who can afford to have more than one place. I think we should tax the sale of those. And I think we should be putting a tax on luxury rental amounts that could help people afford less expensive apartments. And so when I say a tax on luxury apartments, if a one bedroom, the median rent is $3,000, I don't think that a tiny tax on the increment over the 3,000, and 3,000 is a big number. Santa Monica is said to have the highest rental rates in higher rental rates than San Francisco. Again, I don't know. I've just seen these surveys they put out, but I think we should be taxing the great profits that landlords are making on these high rental values that are way above median anywhere in the state. With respect to Uber and Lyft and maybe even scooters and other things, I wonder if we can charge a license fee or require people to get a license similar to the license the taxis get. In other words, we don't let anybody pick up. LA taxis can't pick up in Santa Monica. I mean, we had discussions of deregulating that. We didn't do it. But if taxis need a license to pick up here, shouldn't Uber and Lyft have to have licenses for the vehicles that are picking up people in Santa Monica? The other, so I do have a couple of cost items. Oh, and a license fee for autonomous vehicles. But my final thing is that I think that specifically in the framework, and I'm not going to go through all the comments I had on that. I'll send it to you, and I made annotations on it. But on the affordable housing units, the discussion was, or the metric was how many we create. But I think the other metric needs to be how much each one costs per bedroom and per unit, because it's not enough to just create units. We need to do it efficiently, and that I think we are not quite doing, and I also believe we need to use public land for it. But I'm more concerned with the revenue side of it and how to generate revenues that I think are being eroded by some of these new technologies. And I have to say that I'm guessing that people who are more up with the technologies have even better ideas for how to do it, but those are my ideas. Thank you.
All right, Councilmember Winterer.
So, big picture, I think that, as Councilmember Hemrich mentioned, everybody who worked on this from the top down to the bottom deserves a lot of praise. These are difficult decisions, but I think in the long run, it's very clear to me that it's prudent for us to be making these choices to pay down our long-term pension liability, to give us the city, God, I hope I'm not on this dais in 13 years. But the people who come after us having to make some difficult decisions about how to continue the high level of services people come to expect in Santa Monica will thank us for that choice to pay down that liability, which would otherwise be a great drag on our 2-year budgets. So I think it's great. I appreciate all the ideas that have gone towards creating the framework and the performance metrics. I think big picture, all this is great stuff. To follow up on Councilmember Hemrich's discussion about revenues, I think there are a lot of things we can look at. I am a little concerned, since I worked hard on trying to pass the documentary transfer tax increase a number of years ago to fund affordable housing, that we might run into that buzzsaw again if we try to go after that, but it's probably something worth exploring. I think a vacancy tax is probably more of a policy tool than a genuine revenue enhancer for the city in the big picture. I mean, I've been in favor for a long time just to do something about our streetscapes and the blight of those vacancies, but I can't imagine it's going to all of a sudden going to plug a lot of holes and deficits we have going in years forward. We, as far as I understand, we cannot license TNCs. That's the purview of the California Public Utilities Commission. But I'm certainly in favor of looking at what we might be able to do in terms of what other cities have done, which is put some sort of fee or tax on those rides. I understand the complexities of where the trip originates and where it ends, and the possibilities of having some challenges with that. I think what we might want to contemplate is pursuing something with the Board of Supervisors, doing a county-wide fee on rideshare services, so that, okay, so you originated in Orange County, you don't get taxed, but that's a heck of an Uber ride anyway. So I think we might look beyond just our borders and the possibilities for generating some revenue for all 88 communities in the county and in the unincorporated areas. And there's obviously a nexus between putting the burden, as the city manager mentioned, about the rideshare companies putting the wear and tear on the infrastructure and where our increased costs for traffic management comes from all those cars circulating around here. So I think of all the possible revenue enhancements, that's the one that's probably the easiest to sell politically. The logistics of it might be a bit more complicated. I've also for years have advocated, and it's a very small part of that pie, but other cities charge a higher parking tax rate than we do, and we might want to take a look at that. Big picture, I think we're heading in the right direction. I do think it's worth noting that we did emphasize safety as one of our guiding values, and we've mostly been focused on the crime rates and what the PD can do. We did hear from the firefighters union, and I do think while there's a lot of things that are on these proposed changes, both short-term and long-term, that would address staffing and other issues in the fire department, I would hope that when we look at those, and I'm sure we will, that we do it collaboratively with both the rank and file and the chief and his staff and city staff to make sure that everybody can come in agreement on any potential changes, because safety is important. I mean, I hear loud and clear about how do you take care of people in emergencies on the pier, and how do we get to people in need of assistance. So I want to make sure we emphasize that. In terms of some of these possible changes, this little menu here, we asked some questions. I just have some feedback on some of those. I'm a little circumspect about eliminating the Breeze Bike Share program in the second year of the biennial budget. I think we ought to at least see how the mobility pilot plays out. I think there's a lot of shakeout going on in that industry, and some of the players that are here today may not be here in 2 years. And, you know, we've put some investment into the Breeze Bike Share. Most of the capital costs are covered by grants. I know that it's getting declining ridership, and there's obviously some maintenance to be done on those bikes, but I think we should not jump into getting rid of it until we see how things shake out in that sector, because I think that there's a lot of change afoot there. In terms of eliminating the waived application fees in planning and building and safety, you know, this council and previous councils chose to waive those fees to further specific policy goals, right, to make it easier for certain types of applicants to pursue those permits and licenses. I want to see a cost benefit analysis. I mean, are we really going to save that much money? I'd like to see the actual numbers of the money we could save by eliminating the waiver of the fees. I'm not sure why we're looking at eliminating hedge enforcement, other than that we've placed additional demands on code enforcement, particularly with the new vending laws. I see that Mr. Martin is somewhere, is not usually in his customary seat in the front row, but just go on the record, it's my belief that we've actually been handing out too many variances for increased wall and hedge heights in the city, and the extent we want to pursue a goal of an engaged and thriving community. Having neighbors wall themselves off from their neighbors does not further that goal. And I remind everybody that a number of years ago, when the hedges created a major political upheaval in this city. So I think we want we want to go a little slowly there, and again, see whether we really have made significant cost savings there. I was initially really circumspect about increasing staff design review instead of the ARB, but the extent the city manager mentioned that might be used for restaurants and other small businesses, I would support that, because we need to do everything we can to stimulate business activity in this city, and we have a reputation for being a hard place to do business. If we can make it a little easier for somebody to get to occupy a new space by doing some of that ARB work at the staff level. I'd be in favor of that. I just would not want to take the big projects out of the purview of the ARB, because I think the advantages of having multiple talented members of our community review larger design issues outweighs any cost savings there. And then when we talk, again, the city manager has made it clear that when we looked at cost-effective operations for the out-of-school time youth programs, that we're not looking to diminish their impacts, but I just think it bears emphasis from members of this council that we really want to make sure that there may be efficiencies there, but we want to get the same, if not greater, outcomes, because that's so important to our community. And I think that may be it for my thoughts, at least for the time being.
All right, Councilmember McEwen.
Mayor Davis.
Oh, I'm sorry, I just saw you in the queue there.
I'm so sorry to do this. Could I ask Councilmember Himmelrich to provide her comments on the framework this evening?
Yes, that's fine. I did, when she mentioned she was going to send them, I did have some concern. So I think you need to go ahead, Councilmember Himmelrich, right now.
And I'll make this as quick as possible. So I'll try to make this quick. So one of the things that I think we could get some bang from in terms of revenues, and that I didn't mention before, is grants from federal, state, and county governments. I know that in my own organization, in my day job, we have somebody who's dedicated solely to doing grant proposals, and it's made a tremendous difference in our revenues. I think it could make a big difference in the city revenues. I get HCD, all their notices, and I see that there are $1 million grants out there. Again, I don't know what all of the requirements are, and somebody told me last night that there are similarly $1 million grants from the county from HHH funds that we could, I guess it would be H funds, not HHH, but that are also available for cities like ours. And I don't know if we're doing that already, but I think we should be. I would be in favor of congestion pricing for people coming and driving into the city. Okay, so that's on the revenue. With respect to the schools, I have to say that about maybe a year or two ago, Julie Rusk told me that she had this great data point from the Wellbeing Project that some large number, and I want to say it was close to 50% of the kids in Santa Monica don't do any extracurricular activities and go home to an empty house at the end of the day. So in terms of cutting at least after school services, I would be concerned. I understand that there's an interest of the school district in absorbing before school services, but after school services give me great concerns because of that. So that is that. Hold on. And I'm sorry that I wasn't more organized because I thought I was sending this to you, but at least I have them all blown up. And that, I don't think that's it. But anyway, that's what I am seeing at the moment. And I think that anything else would be duplicative of what I've said already. So thank you.
All right, Councilmember McEwen. He's not in the queue, Councilmember Moreno, but he was actually in the queue.
I pushed both buttons that had my mic on. We have never had a meeting like this. Let's be clear about that. What we're doing here in establishing a framework and a process for this budget is unique. And I want to be very careful that we heed what the city attorney advised and what we heard from the city manager as well, that we're not supposed to be making decisions tonight. What we're supposed to be doing here is absorbing all this information and I hope beginning a conversation with the community because this is all new stuff to a lot of people. And until people understand what has been proposed and absorb it and get a chance to evaluate and balance what the benefits are versus what may be the problems caused for them, I don't think we should be giving definitive direction to staff. Now, the historic preservation community turned out in force tonight, and frankly, what they were asking for I don't think is primarily a budget matter. They weren't asking for additional personnel. I think it's more of a work plan matter, and I think we heard from the city manager that it's already under consideration to some extent. Is that true?
Let me say something I was planning to say. I got credit for this idea, and truly this is coming from PCD, right? They have a very high workload, as you know, in this city. They've had among the most stress on their staff personnel in terms of after hours and et cetera. So kudos to David and the PCD staff. What they're doing is restructuring their staffing to prioritize historic preservation, and by eliminating one planning position, that means other folks will take up a greater workload in that arena, and we'll be able to hire someone with an expertise in historic preservation. We've wanted to solve this problem for a long time. David's worked on this problem for a long time, but we agree that the time has come to have someone, given the workload, who will just focus on that set of issues.
Good. Well, then I can set that aside. And the one thing I will say out of personal opinion is I'm thrilled to see the expansion of the Preserve Our Diversity program. I think that that's a very important thing for us to be focused on. It's so much in keeping with our values. But other than that tonight, I really hesitate to attempt to give even one council member's direction, let alone council direction as a whole, on where to go from here, because I think that discussion with the community is only just beginning and needs to be given a chance to ripen and for us to hear what people think once they've absorbed all this. Tonight, I wouldn't endorse any of the particular recommendations, but at the same time, I think pending more discussion and public input, we shouldn't summarily eliminate any of those options either. I think for my money that the outcome of tonight's meeting should be thank you to staff for having put together such a thoughtful and thought-provoking presentation. We, the council, along with the public, would like some time to think about this, and we have at least 3 more meetings before this budget is adopted, plus a lot of community conversations and presentations. So I think, again, to summarize tonight, what I'd like to say is I don't want to go ahead and endorse anything. I also don't want to go ahead and summarily eliminate anything. Let's consider this the beginning of what's going to be a very interesting conversation.
And if I can just interject, all we are authorized to do tonight is receive and file the information and give general direction to staff. So there will be no motions on any particular item. Councilmember Morena.
All right. So everyone said it. I'll say it again. Staff, you guys killed it. This is really a private sector in my experience. This is what I've done for a really long time. So for me, it feels very normal. I love it, like I said. So thanks again for all your work. So first for me is fire. We heard from Dom. I have direct experience, and you guys should all know about it, with the inspection guys and the prevention guys in my business. In so much as last week, me and some of the guys are literally pushing people out of my place. And let me tell you, it works a lot better when you have a badge than when you don't. So to that end, there's a couple of points in there. I heard from Gigi the cost recovery and cost allocation. So in that regard, there seems to be a lot of different departments within the city that have this cost recovery and cost allocation component. And when that is the case, there's a net zero in that singular business unit. So it'd be helpful to understand what those business units are so that we can evaluate them as such. The other piece with regards to fire, and this may have been I think on us in some of our direction when we did our retreat. We have reducing crime as the sub-outcome of safety. And after going through this and really keeping neighborhoods safe, but then there's a reduce crime in parentheses as a second line item. And then if you look at the team members and the chair, fire's not anywhere included in there. And so it seems appropriate that a team member should at least be part of the fire department in that they're a big part of keeping our city and our neighborhoods safe. my next point is the print shop. We got some correspondence there, and just because it's one piece of kind of where we're going in this process, and I just wanted to understand structurally where it lives. So as the audit committee, we directed our auditors to look at the market study and a work plan and what the valuation was. So how does that fall into this process? Because I was assuming that as an audit commissioner, we were going to hear back from them, and then we were going to make a decision. And so it's a little confusing to me that it's also here. How does that work?
You know, I think you could look at it two ways. You could say we're already doing this, so why put it on the list? The way we look at it is it's already on the list, so let's not leave it off. So we think that given that there isn't a location in the city yards for the print shop, we are going to have to make a decision about the scope and size and direction and cost recovery of the print shop. And so we think these efforts are congruent and not duplicative.
Okay. I see it as a structural component of budget evaluation, just because I thought we did a pretty good job in going through staffing when we were on the audit commission and looking at the myriad of documents and how we analyzed everything, peer cities and all the different project descriptions. There is just a litany of data. And so it would be helpful, I think, for some of the council members here to have highlights in that because it will be helpful to make decisions, as with the print shop. Thank you for reiterating the not reducing POW, Virginia Avenue Park crest. That is very near and dear to me. I'm probably alive because of some of those programs, and I'm not figuratively speaking. So I think it's really important. I also have some special knowledge, and probably Anna and I being from similar neighborhoods, there are ways to enhance those programs. And I can't wait to have that discussion. But it's really important that none of it goes away. And I think you've heard that from all of us. The business revenue generation. So we've talked a lot about the levers and how to help. And I think all great ideas. Some of the tax stuff, some of the maybe policy stuff, some of the things that are really exciting to me are how we improve business opportunities in the city. I am square in the business community, and I can tell you that our issue is not necessarily the levers. Our issue is with our brand perception, right? That is the core of the issue. So we do a lot of things that, discourage small business and discourage businesses in general. And we probably make policies that discourage businesses. But we have to address, at least in my world, the elephant in the room, and that is that Santa Monica is often perceived as business unfriendly. And people do business in Santa Monica, and they want to do business in Santa Monica because it's opportunistic. And I think there's a great opportunity to make money in Santa Monica, but we have to stoke that value, and we have to figure out then how we do that in a way that is meaningful to businesses. So we have those levers in place. I think they're all really good, but we have to create some type of experiential progress or some marketing tactics that will truly benefit business. So that is also very important. The last note that I have is with regards to the Santa Monica USD school district and sharing costs. I haven't seen much of the information that goes between SMMUSD and us and the dollars that we share, much like Carol had pointed out with the preservation planner.
I'm sorry, I'm going to have to interrupt, Greg. Just as we could not discuss the pier because of your involvement, I am only 10 months out of a contract with the school district, and until that is gone a full year, I think, I'll check with the city attorney, but I think by law I'm not supposed to be on the dais when we discuss financial arrangements with the school district.
Councilmember, I will say that it's true for now and look at it right now.
Okay. So if we could just defer that discussion as we have the peer, I would appreciate it.
Sure, absolutely. I'll speak in general about looking at values and metrics, right? I want to make decisions with eyes open, and maybe some of the information that you've been working on for a long time, I would hate to not have enough time to evaluate that information and hear from the public, as Kevin has said, and give us enough runway to be impactful in our decisions.
Gives me the opportunity to, in this case, correct something that I said erroneously. Tim Dodd, in the last budget, got a full-time staffer. I mentioned that he worked in his first year without one, but I don't want to discount the team that he's built. He continues to use interns. In terms of building capacity, the nature is that we can never have one or two or five people effectively measure everything for a city of our complexity. That's why, again, I mentioned Big Blue Bus earlier. They've really been a pioneer. They use private sector terminology, a KPI, which you know, a key performance indicator. That isn't necessarily the vocabulary we use in the public sector, but it is, the concept translates across sectors, which is what's really important, let's measure it. You can't make every single decision based on data for two reasons. One, everything that's important is not always easy to measure, and everything that's easy to measure is not always important. So there always is some level of gut and vision and values involved in decision making. But where we have data, we ought to use it, and where we don't have data, we ought to try to get it and to make better decisions. And we're committed as a whole organization to do that, but it's a work in progress.
Yeah, what I'm talking about specifically is when we're talking about budget allocation, right? And when we're talking about proposed changes, I mean, the budget was come up with at some level, at some point, in some reason, and maybe that was a gut decision many years ago.
Sure.
But going forward, right, I mean, we have to measure our gut, right, and determine if our gut was good or bad. And that evaluation is what I'm interested in, right? And if it wasn't good, let's be honest about it and move on to the next.
As they say in the police department, 100%.
Thank you.
Mayor Pro Tem O'Day.
Thanks. I will try not to duplicate what other council members have said, except to say that this is really great work preparing this, and we're taking on significant change here as an organization, and I know it's not easy. I think the process is going to be illuminating more and more as we go forward. But I want to say I'm in favor of this effort, and importantly, the frame of tonight's conversation has been really around the out years budget deficits that we want to correct for and plan for and create resilience. But I think just as important, even more, is to create to enhance our nimbleness as an organization. I mean, what we've accomplished so far in this report has been challenging, and it amounts to a 1.7% difference in our projected cost. And we ought to have that kind of dynamism in our services and budget just to be effectively identifying the things that are working and favoring those over time through our own decision making. So I do think that continuing to support our analysis and performance management function is critical to go through this process. I also want to point out that on a couple of these things on the list that we've been discussing, some of them are going to be politically hard, and I think we should just go do them because they only get harder over time. And some that are deferred are because we are uncertain how to do them, and we have to study that, and I think that's an important difference. And so if I were to run through a couple of the items that we've discussed already. Some of the things that, starting with what Ted and Sue and Greg said, hitting on the after-school programs and not reducing Pell and Virginia Avenue Park and Crest programs is really critical. We need to be seen that we're continuing to be effective for those communities. I think the opportunities to be more effective and efficient with our communications, like the Seascape I wonder if we could do an opt-in to Seascape. That could be an opportunity to save some funds and to reduce the waste that was identified in the presentation. Residential parking permits shifting to 2 years. I don't see that as an item that needs to be studied. Maybe it's a little bit difficult, but maybe we want to take that step in this budget as opposed to kicking it into the midterm process changes. I appreciate what Councilmember Winterer said about the Breeze Bike Share program. At the same time, if we're saving money in that program, then we'd be able to improve the service for programs that are provided by the private sector through our oversight. And so I think it's a useful one to consider, and it may just take the time to assess that. But I do think that making some significant change there, even if it's not an elimination of Breeze, is going to be in our interest in this budget cycle. I appreciate Councilmember Reyna's points on the fire inspection services, and I would add to I just underscore those. And on the reduction of the grace period for parking downtown from 90 to 60 minutes, I'm pretty sure I already voted on that one, and it was 60 minutes in my vote, but I didn't get it. So those are the ones that kind of jumped out for me as opportunities to try to shift some of the savings into near years and to enhance the nimbleness that I think we're trying to go for as an organization, so that we can really be more effective and have a more dynamic organization and conversations when we're doing this work. Thanks.
Councilmember Hara.
I just want to start also off by saying thank you so much for providing such an extended educational report for me. It is quite a process that being exposed to now. Okay, and I appreciate very much that you did such a wonderful job. There are lots of questions that I have, but not being able to give you any direction, then I will go ahead and I will hold those for later on as we continue on with our process. But I do want to thank City Manager Rick Hole for giving us the clarification that these programs like Powellcrest and Virginia Avenue Park are not on the chopping block. And I am certain that there will be a lot of people that will be happy to hear that news. And I look forward to us to continue to work together so that we can make the proper decisions when we need to, even if they are hard decisions, that we will be able to make them very educationally. So thank you.
Councilmember Morena.
Just really quick to follow up on Terry's comments and the idea of nimbleness. That's often why government gets beat out of various sectors of the economy, is because private business is typically more nimble. I've met with every department in the city, and I've met a lot of your staff and the staff members, and incredibly smart, dedicated, passionate people. There is no reason that we can't be as nimble, as good, if not better, than the private sector. So I just wanted to underscore what Councilmember O'Day had said. I think you pointed out, Rick, something that is really important. It's a nuance in the idea of making decisions on gut. So something like what Terry suggested about changing preferential parking permits to every 2 years, that's a gut decision. Let's just do it and then figure out if it works. And if it doesn't, oh well, let's change it and let's redirect. And that's not direction, but that's a general concept of the various items where I think we can make impactful gut decisions.
All right, I haven't taken a turn yet. So I do want to thank everyone for all the hard work that went into a very complex presentation. I want to start out because we've talked a lot about CREST this evening. And, you know, I think there have been some comments like PAL, Virginia Avenue Park are not on the chopping block. And I guess I maybe interpreted it a different way, which is not that any of those programs are guaranteed to be cut, but that they may be duplicative. And that when we think about the way we deliver after-school care services, so I don't want people to be misled that if we see a budget 2-3 years down the road and all of a sudden these programs have a different name and they're going, but where's my Virginia Avenue Park program or where's CREST? So I would appreciate maybe a little bit of clarification on that from the city manager so that people aren't misled, if you don't mind. I mean, I just want to make it clear, I don't think that you're thinking that all of those programs are going to remain the way they are now. What you're saying is we're going to deliver the same level, if not a better level of services, but it may not be in the same configuration. Would that be a fair statement?
That is absolutely correct. Okay. The value of services to our youth is unquestioned, and we need to keep the same level, if not enhance it. I'm not convinced that the system that's evolved over many decades is the best way to do that.
So I want to start off with an overall sort of thought, and we're not giving specific direction tonight, although I do have a couple of fairly specific comments about things that were in the staff report, but I'll get to those in a moment. You know, frequently when the school district, and you don't need to worry about Kevin, I'm not going to talk about anything about our relationship with the school district, but when they address budgetary issues, they always talk about keeping the cuts away from the classroom. And I think to some extent, as we go through this process, because a budget is a reflection of our values, to me the important thing is to try and keep the cuts away from people as much as possible. That, and without making any comments about any of the specific items that have been discussed, to me it is much more important that we continue to provide services, particularly to those people most in need, than maybe keep some stuff, if that makes sense. That's not to say stuff isn't important. That's not to say buildings aren't important. It's not to say, certain kinds of material things that we produce are not important. But to me, it seems that as we go through this process over the next few years, that the key to achieving both the strategic budgetary framework that we've identified as well as the values that we've identified is really think about delivering services to our people. And, sometimes we're going to have to make a choice between things and services. So I just wanted to throw that out as maybe something to think about as we go through the process. And to that, I'm going to make a very specific comment about the staff report that I was stunned to see that for the framework priority engaged and thriving community, that the allocation of money was that staff was proposing to reallocate funding for the ongoing maintenance of the city's new website. I don't know, I'm willing to be corrected, but I think when we listed engaged and thriving community as one of our priorities at the retreat, not a single one of us first thought, oh goody, now we get to maintain the website. I think we were thinking about much more people-oriented things. And so as we go through this process, that's a governance item. I'm not saying that having a website and maintaining it is not important. That is not, to me, an appropriate allocation to the engaged and thriving community goal. And I think it's important to do that because, by the same token, we got lovely readouts on the framework for a sustainable city of well-being, and as staff pointed out, of course, there wasn't one for the engaged and thriving community, and apparently that's because it was a new framework. It didn't strike me as a new framework, but that's okay. But I think of all the things that we talk about, and I'm going to get to why this is important in a second, it may be the most difficult for people to comprehend, and if we don't, in our presentations, treat it with the same solemnity and equality that we do things like reducing homelessness and reducing crime in this city, then we're doing ourselves a disservice. And this is why. And this goes specifically, Ms. Taslimi pointed out that the Human Services Grant Program, we're talking about focusing on homelessness. And I said this at the retreat, but I'm going to say it again just to bore you all at 9:26 in the evening, is that I view homelessness, I view crime, I view those as symptoms of an underlying disease. And that underlying disease is a lack of well-being in our community. And that's why I asked you, when you're talking about sometimes you have to spend money to make money sort of thing, that we can certainly spend a tremendous amount of our money trying to solve homelessness and trying to reduce crime, and we should. But if we don't solve the underlying well-being crisis, we will spend more money solving those acute symptoms. That an investment in well-being will pay off over time. Just like in the school community, an investment in early childhood education reduces expenditures later in the school, in an educational process. So I think it's important that we not just say, okay, I can save money here, but think about, if I spend money here, will I save money down the road? And to me, an investment in engaged and thriving community is not about communications, although that's certainly an element of it, but it is really how do we tackle that fundamental lack of well-being in our community. And just to, talk about, for example, many of the people that are homeless on our streets are mentally ill. So how do we address that problem with mental illness? That's a well-being, that's an engaged and thriving community issue. And so I sort of hate to see us focus so much on the short term that we're not focusing on the long-term payoffs. And for that reason, for example, losing things like Connections for Children and other early childhood education programs and other things in the Human Services Grant Program, while it's certainly easy to say, we have a homeless problem and let's solve it, I want to not just manage the problem in its current configuration, but I really want to genuinely solve it. And I think that's going to mean thinking about longer term investments in the well-being of our community. I also just want to address a couple of other things that I think are important to remember. And one is we've talked a lot about various new revenue sources. I support looking at any new revenue sources. I don't know if they're all good, but I think they're all things staff should look at. To the extent we need to lobby our representatives in Sacramento to try and, bring those online, because I don't think we'd be alone. My guess is every community is having this same discussion, maybe not at the same advanced level because they're not doing the same work, but it seems to me we need to reach out to our sister communities and say, hey, there are some changes that need to be made that will allow us to do things like perhaps tax the TNCs or something like that in a more effective way through a licensing fee or something. And the second thing I want to say is that, so I think we need to look at revenues. I think as we talk about cuts, and the fire department may be a perfect example, we can look at things and say, here's a better way to do it. And I fully support budgetary efficiencies. And I've been one of the people, I think with many other colleagues on this council, that have been resistant, for example, to the idea of contracting out services, because I believe that public service is one of the key areas where people can still join an organization and work their way up through the organization and have good benefits and good pay. And so I think that to the extent we are thinking about, I don't know any other word to use, outsourcing some activities, I would hope, and this goes back to my mantra a little bit, that if we're going to let's outsource the things that have less of a direct impact on people. It seems to me, for example, fire services, as Councilmember Morena mentioned, and other things may have a direct impact on safety. I don't know. I don't know enough about it. But I do think that if we set some value-laden criteria for ourselves and say, is this something that's really going to affect the delivery of services to our community, or is this something that we can, I hate the word, outsource with minimal impact on the community, I would view those, that would help me make that decision about what we should do. So I'm hopeful that as we go through this process, and I want to circle back on the CREST issue. I think one of the reasons people were upset is because all we did was talk about the cuts and didn't give them the assurances that we're going to continue to deliver the same level of services, regardless of how it's packaged. And so as you come back in the budget and talk about cuts, to the extent you can give people, if not assurances, at least, yes, we're going to cut here, but here's what we see the impact will be, or maybe the impact will be nil or minimal. I think it's important to give people those reassurances, because the time between when the budget's going to be released on May 23rd, and happy anniversary, Ms. Lichtig, and when we're going to discuss it in early June gives a lot of people time to stew and get frantic about things. And so I think we need to be careful as we produce this budget and we produce the reports for those meetings, that to the extent we can make sure people understand that we are trying to be more efficient as opposed to just making cuts. That will be important. And then the final comment I want to make is the task force. I think we'll have that discussion later on. The thing I would really want to emphasize is that, and I think Councilmember McEwen emphasized it, and he's absolutely right, outreach on the budget is going to be key. But I think the other thing that's really key is that we, as you mentioned, Mr. Cole, not round up the usual suspects. I think that this is an opportunity to really bring in different voices to a very difficult process, and the voices who are probably going to be most directly affected by the process. And so those are the people that I would like to see on the task force, the people who are going to have to sit there and go, I'm losing this service, or I'm not going to be able to provide this service from an employee standpoint. So I think as we do this, while it certainly will be important to have people with budgeting and business experience, from my standpoint, what's more important to me is to hear from the people who will be directly affected by what we're proposing to do here. So that's the summary of my comments. And you're, Mr. Cole, in the queue. Do you mean to be in the queue? All right, Mr. Cole, then.
First of all, thank you, members of the council, for acknowledging the enormous work of the entire organization in producing tonight's presentation, and more importantly, the 6-year plan that we'll be presenting on May 23rd. I am deeply grateful. In the charter, it's the city manager's job to present a budget, and the buck does stop with the city manager under our system. But I could not have produced the quality and the depth and sophistication. We just have so many smart and able people, and I want to acknowledge as well the other charter officers, our city attorney and our city clerk. There's inherent tension in the city manager having the responsibility for recommending their budgets, and we've worked hard to bridge that inherent tension that's built into the system, because what they do, what our city clerk does and what our city attorney does, is every bit as important as everything that falls under my jurisdiction, and we could not work without a partnership with both of their offices, and adequately resourcing both of their offices is critically important, as it is for the departments that report to the city manager under our system. So thank you for acknowledging all the hard work, and I particularly want to acknowledge our Chief Operating Officer, Katie Lichtig, who has really spearheaded this effort. I've been the spokesperson for it tonight, but she's been the laboring oar in the city manager's office, not only for coordinating the whole process, but also for our own department of the city manager's office. We've tried to set the example in our office of being efficient. And of course, our chief financial officer, there literally is no one else in the state of California I would rather have in that job than Gigi Jacobellis Hughes. Her command of the numbers, working with her team headed by Susan Lay, and her amazing ability to be patient through the most interminable, contentious, challenging, complicated is really quite remarkable, and the team that she heads in the finance department is remarkable, and the team that in the budget team that then work with the the budget specialists and the department heads in each of the departments is really quite remarkable. So thank you for acknowledging what has been a team effort tonight. And this, I've been at this for 37 years, and I've had responsibility for a $7 billion budget in the second largest city in the country. Not sole responsibility, obviously. That's part of the problem in Los Angeles. No one has the sole responsibility for it. But I was the deputy mayor for the budget. I've been responsible for budgets now in 3 cities and long time chair of the finance committee in my hometown of Pasadena, sitting in elective office. So I've spent my life in the shadow of Proposition 13. Not that all of our problems could be blamed on that decision. I blame all of the problems that we have on the failure of the state legislature and the governor for the last 40 years to build a sensible structure for financing basic services that people rely on. Everything you've talked about tonight, youth services, fire protection, police protection, our libraries, which have gone unmentioned tonight, but are one of the most amazing assets of this community, and on, code enforcement, etc. We're still operating under emergency legislation passed within a couple of months of the passage of Proposition 13. That's never been revisited, that's never been fixed, that's never been reformed, that's never been brought up to date. We have a 20th century tax system and a rickety one at that. So I want to thank the 7 of you and the community that's elected you. I know a lot about local government in Southern California, and there aren't very many cities who are tackling the long-term challenges of our infrastructure and our well-being and our environmental sustainability and our fiscal health the way this council has in the past and is in the future. I think we're setting an example. We'll be one of exactly 2 cities out of 482 cities who will be able to tackle our unfunded pension liability. Everyone else, as Councilmember Moreno said, is kind of kicking the can down the road and burying their head in the sand. I don't say they're stupid. I don't say that they lack courage, but I do say they've got the water up to their nostrils and they're just basically trying to swim. We're leading, and I thank all 7 of you for the thoughtful way in which you're leading this city.
All right, thank you very much. Ms. Anderson-Warren, do we need a motion just to receive the report?
I would like it if you would.
All right.
I move we receive the report.
Second.
All right.
I'll
Moved
make
by.
a friendly amendment, we file it as well.
All right.
I don't think that's friendly. Don't get it.
All right. We have a motion to receive and file the report made by Winterer, seconded by Moreno. I think we can do this by voice vote, if I'm not mistaken.
correct.
All right. All those in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? Thank you very much. And again, we want to reiterate we appreciate all the hard work that went into this process. Thank you.
Before you adjourn, can you? Oh,
We have a couple of items.
The meeting is not over yet, folks, if you could try and
That's
keep it
right.
down.
Yeah. If you can keep the conversation down till you get past the doors, that would be greatly appreciated.
I didn't think so. Where are we at? I thought we were.
All right. No, we have a couple of, we don't have any items. So first, I need to invite members of the community to a community meeting hosted by the LA County Clerk's Office and LA League of Women Voters at Virginia Avenue Park on Tuesday, May 7th at 6 p.m., where the community will have the opportunity to learn about the county's vote centers and the new voting experience. And I believe we do have an adjournment.
We do. Council, I ask that we adjourn tonight in memory of one of the artists who created the dinosaurs on the 3rd Street Promenade in downtown Santa Monica. Claude Lalonde died earlier this month at home in Paris. She and her late husband were part of a circle of artists that included Rene Magritte and Salvador Dali. Claude Lalonde leaves 4 daughters, 6 grandchildren, and 6 beloved Santa Monica dinosaurs.
We are grateful that she has entrusted them to us. Our next regular meeting will be on Tuesday, May 14th at 5:30 p.m. Same bat time, same bat channel. We'll right here. Thank you very much, everybody. That's right.